Social distancing, you say? The future is watching. Welcome to Opcode Virtual Summit.
Hi, and welcome back for a third edition of Opcode Virtual Summit. Sorry, we had some last-minute issues, so lesson learned. You know, if you ever have the wrong time showing on a YouTube video, don't try to change it 5 minutes before because it may create some conflict after, and you may have to like publish it manually. So it's always good to know. But yeah, welcome back. Thanks for being here again today. And like I was saying, this is the third edition. We're gonna have a fourth edition pretty soon. Actually, here's the date. So the date is gonna be May 6th. And Thomas Reed is gonna give the keynote for that one. For those who are coming here for the first time, and well, you may know the conference. So we used to be a physical conference. I guess a month ago now, we decided to go online. So I'm pretty much running this from my bedroom now, and it's turning into a studio now with the lights. You can probably see the reflection here. But yeah. So if you have any questions or comments, as usual, just use the chat where you can actually like ask all your questions and just post all your stuff. So and during the Q&A sessions, I can also like take them and ask the speakers about them. And for social media, so I created a special page for that. Well, first of all, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, because every time we go live, at least you can get a notification, and it makes things much easier. On Twitter, obviously, you can use the hashtag Opcode 2020, and then you would appear in the corner here, I guess. And that's all those tweets that we see are just like from Twitter directly. And well, we used to have an IRC server, but after like a few weeks, you know, like only 10 people joined, and I gave up on the IRC server thing. And now we have a Discord server, which is much more convenient and actually more practical than IRC, but it was pretty good to have some IRC server going around for a while. And as usual, the slides of the presentation will be available on GitHub. So this is the link. And after that, usually after the conference, so like in few hours or max tomorrow, the slide should be up, and the video is going to be available right after. So that's pretty much it for like the social notes. And yeah, so that's our agenda for today. So we are pretty lucky. We have Alex from Circle and the core team of MISP, who's gonna give the opening keynote. So that should be pretty interesting. And given that MISP is getting more and more like popular now, especially now with the coronavirus, we're realizing like it's pretty good to have some free open source threat intelligence platform to use. And after, we're gonna have Juan, who's gonna talk to us about some of the findings he has from one of the shadow broker leaked file against one of the target from, I mean, he will tell you more in details. And then we're gonna have a panel on vulnerability disclosure. I know it's quite a boring topic usually, and it's kind of very redundant. We've been talking about it for a long time. So the idea is try to make it interesting, and if you have good questions, you know, like around it, so it's a good time to raise them. And last but not least, we're gonna have Josh from Swimlane, who's gonna give us a presentation about how he has been instrumenting Microsoft Graph API. So that should be also like a pretty cool So without further ado, I guess that's pretty much it for the introduction today. And yeah, we're just gonna get ready for our next speaker. So I'm just gonna launch the introduction, and we are gonna have Alex speaking.
Social distancing, you say? The future is watching. Welcome to Opcode Virtual Summit.
Okay, perfect. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be here today, and thanks to Matt for organizing such kind of virtual conference today. So what I will talk today is about information sharing, and what we have been doing for the past 8 years is basically doing information sharing. And it started as a very small things, and we basically evolved into something that is much bigger nowadays. So I will basically talk about what we did as MISP project, and what was successful, and especially the pitfalls and the mistake we did. Because I think the best thing to learn, I think, from information sharing communities is to know how they work, and basically based on that, you can build your own communities. So I'm one of the core members of the MISP project. So I will not go into detail about the MISP project itself, but I'll talk more about all those sharing communities and how sharing is really saving us nowadays. So there's a bright side of information sharing communities. So for the past year at Circle, we built a lot of sharing communities. We basically build sharing communities for us. We basically build sharing communities for other organizations. And we had some successful things. So we, for example, have one of our biggest communities is basically more than 1,500 organizations and more than 4,000 users that are basically actively doing sharing of information. So they basically share indicators, trajectory information, and trade intelligence. We have some sharing communities where people are basically sharing financial indicators and even trade and so on. And it's really acting as both ways. So people are sharing actively things that they have seen, but they are even confirming, or for example, doing sightings of the information itself. So for doing that, we really act on two things. One is basically the tooling. So MISP is the platform that we develop and maintain. So it's basically a full-time job within the teams where we basically develop and maintain the software. It's an open source trade sharing platform. It will remain open source. It will be always open source. That's really a key point for us for having something that is basically auditable and usable by everyone. But besides the tool itself, you have a lot of practices and things about how to build those sharing communities. Things about the structurations and the structure of information, like the standard format and so on, and classifications, contextualization of information. Those one play really an important role. And those practices, I want to talk a bit about those 2 days and a bit some, I would say, good stories of things that really failed and things that were really successful and how we did that. So another question that you might ask is, how can you be successful of building a sharing communities? And to be honest, there is no plan. It was basically a series of mistakes that we did over the past 8 years that help us to build what we did today. So we really built things that are not really with like complex and roadmaps and so on. We were really building and solving problems step by step. And that's really the thing and I think it's part of the success is we basically had an organic growth of the MISP platforms. And all the sharing communities, I mean, the most successful sharing communities that we have seen are basically coming from organic growth. And what I want really to share with you is basically the series of mistakes. And one of the first mistakes that we did was basically, it's where everything started. So at trans-European level, we do what we call those kind of malware workgroup meetings where we basically discuss about what we are working on. And in 2012, we basically had some really sensitive analysis ongoing in incident response. And we basically, as those kind of physical meeting on a quarterly basis, we basically go there, do presentation of what we are working on, what kind of thing that we are reversing. And we did a presentation with what we were working on, and one of our colleagues from the other countries like look at it and were like, oh, we did exactly the same the past 2 months. And we were like, oh, great. And so basically, we were wasting 2 months of work doing something that was basically exactly the same without sharing. And it's not because we were not willing to share, but it's because we had not the tools to share. And luckily at that time, we had some guys from the Ministry of Defense called Christophe van der Plat that started to do a small platform called SiteDefSeek, which was basically the premises of MISP itself. And what we basically did is say, okay, that day we said, okay, we should use that platforms, make it open source, and use it even internally for all incident response and sharing information. And that's basically everything started. So, and that's where the initial name of MISP started. It started as a malware information sharing platform. But nowadays, I will explain that. We will share. There are a lot of people sharing different kind of informations, so it's not anymore malware. But the thing is, it's really the building of MISP was really based on that, of having contribution from others, feedback from users, and it's an organic growth. So we didn't plan like 2 or 3 or 5 years in advance. We were basically doing the work on a day-to-day basis. And nowadays, a community-driven project, we have more than 400 contributors to the MISP project, people that are doing software development, but other people that are contributing to the galaxies and so on. The MISP project itself is more than 50 repositories in GitHub. So it's a pretty large community. Now the thing is, you have the tools, that's great. But the thing is, how do you succeed to have a sharing communities? And I'll start with one of the things. So when we started to use MISP and develop MISP, it was really for our own needs. But then we were like, okay, we have a platform that we could use for sharing. So why don't we set up a sharing communities for our constituents? So that means members of our CSIRT, and that people could share information. And that's where everything started too. We basically started to use MISP as a sharing tools and as a building a sharing communities. And one of the first problems that we faced was the legal framework. And I think maybe a lot of people here are facing this kind of problems. It's the legal framework. So if you go to the lawyer, so your legal advisor, they might say to you, oh, you cannot share information because you have this legal framework and so on. And what we discover is basically don't be abused by the legal framework. If you really want to build the sharing communities, use the framework itself and start to be clever on that. And that's what we try to do nowadays to help everyone. So for example, on the MISP project webpage, we have a complete set of documents for compliance. So that means you don't have to worry about it. Basically use a legal framework to support your tools and not to basically limit yourself. And that's really one of our experience. So for example, one of the sharing communities that we started with a very legal, complex document of, I think it was 12 pages. And after the second organization joining, they wanted to ask to change the documents, and we discovered that basically it was basically prone to fail. You don't want to do that. So what we decided to do is basically to get rid completely of the legal framework, because what we wanted to say is basically the legal framework already exists. You don't need to have an additional contract and so on. And one of our success for one of the sharing communities, basically, it's very lax on the legal side, but a lot of people are still contributing and so on. So that's something to keep in mind. If you want to build your sharing communities, don't be afraid to basically play with the legal framework. Basically, every one of us are basically hackers, so don't hesitate to hack the legal frameworks. That might help you at the end. Another thing that is quite interesting is basically leading by example. So if you start sharing communities and you start a MISP instance, a lot of organizations start like that. They start an instance without any information inside. And then you have people that are basically looking at the information and there's nothing. So no one is contributing. And that's basically where it's starting. You need to feed the machines. You need to feed the system with data. And that's the interesting part. Humans tend to imitate. If you start to create information, so event in MISP, with threat intelligence, context, information, and so on, you start to see other people imitating what you are doing. And that's really the thing that you need to do, is basically to feed the system. If you feed your system on a day-to-day basis, you basically get new informations. And the thing that we have seen is basically more you contextualize information, more people can use it. For example, some of the MISP community that we were running some like 7 years ago had really little context. It was just barely a list of indicators and so on. Nowadays, you have full-blown attack trees, you basically have information about the threat actors, you basically have intelligence regarding to the threat actors and so on. So it's really something that you need to consider. Another thing that we have seen is don't be afraid of sharing or you reach your goal. So for example, if you have you share an event with, for example, extraction of configuration from a malware, don't just put the extracted configuration of the malware, add the tooling for supporting the extractions. And you'll see that by doing that, you basically increase the capabilities of the other in the group. And a good example we had recently, I would say a very nasty malware where it's a lot of obfuscations, and it was really difficult to basically get the encryption string. And one of the contributors found a way to do it. And he started to contribute the tools. And afterwards, you see the next days, people starting to contributing more keys from other malwares and so on, because they discover all the guys was doing it and they increase their capabilities. So don't hesitate to basically share not only the result, but how you reach your result, the tooling, the processes, and so on. And that's really a way to basically build your sharing communities. And that's the same for some sharing communities that are like in the scientific area or even in the health sector for COVID and so on. If people show how to, for example, do analysis of data and so on, people are trying to reproduce the things, to validate the data and stuff like that. So it's really important on a day-to-day basis. Another thing that we have seen is we have seen some sharing communities that force you to share information. And that's basically one of the biggest failures that you can see. Because when you do that, people try to feed information into the systems to basically share such kind of information. So for example, to keep and to remain in the system, they were like sharing information they collect from the internet. So the quality of information will go down just to remain on the systems. And if you think about it, basically having just people at least using the data, it's already a quick win for sharing communities. So that's super important. When you basically share information, that you think about people using your data. And what we have seen is a lot of communities, if you reach a successful sharing communities, around 30% of people are actively sharing data. The rest are basically using the data. And it's already a quick win. I mean, if you look at some of the projects like Wikipedia and so on, the number of contributors is below 1%. If you have a sharing communities in cybersecurity where you have 30% people contributing, it's more than a success. And that's something that you really want to keep. It's basically to be very welcoming into a communities, because what you tend to say is the leader of today might be the contributor of tomorrow. So don't hesitate to have people that are basically only leeching the data and using it, because 1 year later, they might become the biggest contributor to the platforms. So that's something to keep in mind when you have sharing communities. Another thing that is very important is contextualizations. So in MISP, we have what we call galaxies. So galaxies are basically custom set of knowledge base, but you can basically construct there your own classification and so on. And in MISP, we come with a pre-built list of galaxies. Those galaxies help you to basically attach information. For example, if you have, for example, an event related to subnet or SOFACI, you can basically attach all the information related to SOFACI directly. So that's something that you have to really keep in mind. When you add context, it's helping people to use the data, not only to basically do for detections, but it's helping them to know the technique of the attackers, to filter out the data, to see what is interesting for them and so on. As an example, we are operating a MISP sharing communities for COVID. And in that community, we share 3 kinds of information. We share health information, cybersecurity, and nowadays disinformation. And all this information is there, but we add context, so like that people can cherry pick, filter around, and use the data for their own use. So for example, we have a huge list of threat actors. So I think we maintain one of the biggest lists nowadays of threat actors. We maintain synonyms. So you know how painful it is to maintain such kind of thing, but it's, I think, helping people to basically at least name things in the right way, and that is in the similar way. We have a very huge list, for example, for ransomware, including a lot of meta informations, like, for example, extension files, the ransom notes, the kind of encryption they use, and so on. So like that, you can really document when you find a case to see if it's a known ransomware, to see if you can decrypt it or not, if it's a known techniques, if it's similar to some other man ransomware. So you might find, for example, similarities in ransom notes and so on. We have some other for exploit kit and so on. But you can describe plenty of other things. For example, we have one for preventive actions. So not only to share information about detections, you could share information about the preventive measures that you can basically have. So for example, if you have a specific ransomware, you can have, for example, some preventive measure regarding backups or kind of backup that you need to basically operate to avoid such kind of malware or at least limit the impact. We basically import existing classification schemes. So for example, my tray attack models is basically imported into MISP as a galaxy. But we have plenty of others, like for example, the misinformation patterns, which is the AMIT one, which is there to describe informations like misinformation, fake news, and so on directly into MISP. And what we try to do is in MISP, people can basically extend the software without having to understand the software behind. So they can basically build their own knowledge base behind. So it's simple JSON. So if you build a sharing community, that's something that we usually say, that don't force yourself to use one standard. If you are, I think, a large community and you really feel better, do it. In MISP, it's possible. We have galaxies and taxonomies for that. You can basically extend it, and you can share it back. Either you share it back, or you keep it for yourself. For example, we have a lot of military organizations that are using MISP. Obviously, they don't share back the information about the threat actor and the classifications, but they use a standard format for them to basically extend MISP and support their different use cases. And if you have some other idea of galaxies and so on, you are more than welcome. You can do a pull request. Nowadays, we have around 30 type of galaxies. But if you want to extend it, just propose one. If you don't know how to do it, just contact us and we can even help you to do that. So as an example of sharing communities, we operate right now. Just after COVID started, we were like, okay, we have the MISP software and we want to share information about it. Because we have seen a lot of overlap, and I think that is quite interesting. It's something that's basically overlap between different sectors because people will abuse the COVID situations to basically make phishing, make spear phishing, specific attacks and stuff like that. So we wanted to have really a sharing community that is specific to such kind of use case. So nowadays we basically share two main areas, so medical and cyber threat. Recently we introduced misinformations thanks to CockSec for importing this kind of data there. If you want to join, you are more than welcome. You can go to the web page mentioned there. There's a self-registration process and you can register. There are already close to 1,000 users there. People are actively using. You have Isaac in the medical sector, so you have others. We try to basically keep track of various things, like for example, specific malicious domains that are used for trapping users. But on the other hand, we maintain list of legitimate COVID websites too. So like that to avoid false positive into a system and so on. And I think so when we started to do this, why we do that? I mean, for us, it's like we have interest at personal level, not only at professional level. So if as an organization or as a group of people, you want to start your own community, do it. It's basically a very low entry barrier to do it. The software is open source, so you can really run your sharing communities. And we have seen organizations that are basically starting in a day sharing communities. And they start slowly by importing different data sets and so on, and they start to have this kind of community, and then the traction is starting. Another thing that we have seen, and that's something that is quite interesting too, a lot of information that we have seen are sometimes shared in two kind of silo of information. And that's kind of a pity because a lot of information can basically overlap. So for example, we have seen in the financial sectors, some overlap with some cybersecurity related cases, for example, for cash out of money. So for example, some banking or some mule networks are basically used by different kind of criminals, not only cyber criminals, but some more classical financial criminals. And they basically use the same networks. And if you don't share the information between those two kind of sector of activities, you don't see the overlap. And that's why we try to basically have some kind of sharing communities where you basically have different kind of sectors together. And when you start to see the correlation between the data set, you start to see like interesting trend of things like, okay, those kind of criminals are maybe using the same kind of techniques or the same infrastructures for supporting their activities. So that's something to keep in mind. So thing that we try to do in MISP, and that's coming from our experience, from the early beginning of MISP, we had this kind of mindset where we say, okay, maybe we should not bound ourselves to a specific standard. And we came with this model in MISP where you can basically template your object models. So for the one that are familiar to network security and network monitoring, it's close to, very similar to the network protocol called NetFlow, where you basically define templates, where you can define your own template to share information. And that's basically what we do in MISP. So when we started, for example, the COVID-19 MISP communities, we wanted to create objects related to COVID-19, obviously. So we basically take a template, and it's a JSON file, so you can basically extend it. So with MISP, you can really create your own object. We have around 250 objects nowadays, templates, but you can create your own template. In this case, we created the template based on the Johns Hopkins dataset. And those templates are basically just describing the number of infections, deaths, and recovered from a specific region. And that took like 5 minutes when you know to do the JSON files. And that's basically the thing that we try to do. In information sharing, we try to be basically not bound to standard, but to be basically bound to your use case. So if you have a specific use case to describe, as long as the format is basically very flexible, you can do it out of the box. And that's really what we want to do in MISP. And thanks to this kind of models, you can really build your own communities. And what we have seen is, over the past years, we have seen a huge number of new communities popping up. And I just want to talk about some that we have seen. So for example, obviously, our field of activities is CSIRT, so Incident Response Team, CERT. So initially, the first major user of MISP were basically cybersecurity related, CSIRT, Security Operations Center, and so on. So that's quite interesting there, because you see that people were like focusing on cybersecurity. And I mean, it's not a secret, Circle is located in Luxembourg. In Luxembourg, the financial sector is taking like an important place. And we have seen a huge interest in the financial sector to start to build sharing communities too. So again, and that's where we started with those kind of flexible model of data modeling. We say, okay, maybe for financial fraud, we should use the same platforms, but be flexible on the data set. And then we have seen a lot of new specific sharing communities popping up. So we are part of some, but some others are basically completely standalone and independent. Something to really keep in mind with MISP, when you start a MISP instance and you start to use it, you basically build the sharing communities. And it's up to you to decide if it's a private one, it's a private club, or is it something that you basically want to bridge with others or to share with a specific community, a specific region, and so on. And that's really important. When you basically create a MISP instance, you have to define yourself what you want to do with it. So, for example, a lot of organizations that are building private one are only, for example, using it for sharing within different teams. So, for example, they have a SOC team, they have a threat intelligence teams. They basically use MISP to share between two teams. So the tool itself is there to facilitate the sharing of information, structured information sharings. We know how painful it is to basically deal with emails containing IOCs, indicators, threat intelligence is super painful. You really don't want to do that. You really want to automate, to do correlation automatically, and so on. So when we started to introduce this kind of model in MISP of being able to basically change the data structures, we have seen plenty of other organizations starting their own models. And I can discuss about some that are public. For example, some border control organizations and agencies are using MISP to share information. For example, I've seen a very interesting use case. So it's a country. They basically have different points where they do seizing of goods crossing the borders. And they have these classical problems when they seize goods. They don't exactly know if the goods is for example, on a blacklist or is something that is illegal and so on, because they need experts to validate. So for example, they have those kind of chemical components that sometimes are illegal because they might be used for doing drugs and so on. So what they do, they use MISP to store information about what they seized, like pictures, details about labels on the chemicals and so on. And then you have experts within their field that are connecting to MISP and reviewing the seizing and seeing, okay, this one is maybe something that is obviously dangerous and illicit, or is not. And that's quite interesting that we have seen that such kind of organization just basically using the tools for their own use case, and they just basically revamp it to support their use case. Another interesting use case that we have seen is the vulnerability disclosure process, and I think it's interesting because you have a roundtable about it. A lot of vulnerability disclosure is basically pre-notifications, like all those embargo vulnerabilities. So we have seen people that are basically using MISP to distribute pre-embargo informations to very sensitive customers. So for example, we have seen a large organization that are fixing bugs into hardware equipment, and the lifetime for vulnerability in hardware equipment and the time that is basically fixed, it's very long compared to just pure software. And what they were doing is basically they still want to disclose this vulnerability to their main customers before that is really fixed. So they basically use MISP as a sharing platform to share this kind of pre-notification vulnerabilities. So it's a way to engage with their customers directly and to have a kind of safe way to share information, and then the customer can even basically improve the vulnerability disclosure process and improve there. And then you have plenty of very, I would say, funky use case or exotic use case, especially in the intelligence communities. I've seen one from a country where basically they use it to share their signal interceptions report through MISP. So they basically review signal interception through MISP, so like that they can do collaborative work on it. So it's quite interesting. So it's basically just private between them, but it's a way to basically exchange information. So the thing is, if you start using MISP, there's an easy way to do it. You basically download the virtual machines of a MISP instance. You basically start play with it. Another option, you basically ask to join one of the MISP communities. On the MISP website, you see you have already some public communities, and you can start your own, basically have your own feeling of all the communities working and how people are sharing information. So that's something that people can basically do. So the thing that is interesting too is you see that the tool is basically so flexible that people can really change it for their own needs. And for us, it's really interesting to see what can benefit for the community. So if you do changes that you think that is interesting for the whole community, don't hesitate to come back to us. And we are really open for integration of new functionality into MISP. So for example, the complete new dashboard functionalities came due to COVID-19. So between brackets, I would say thanks to COVID-19 for that, because we were able to basically starting to have those kind of dashboard for this use case. And then this use case apply at the end for all trade intelligence. So we basically know a dashboard for all trade intelligence information and so on. So that's basically the thing behind. So that's basically the thing. So you have a lot of sharing communities. We know that more than 60,000 organizations are using MISP worldwide. Some are basically completely private. Don't hesitate to ask maybe existing member of communities to connect to their MISP. It's super easy to do synchronizations. So for example, to synchronize between two MISP is just a matter of configuration of 1 or 2 minutes. So for the one that ever use Taxi, for example, they will see the difference. It's super easy. And really, I want to conclude on that. So the project started as really a specific use case in cybersecurity. And today is basically a versatile project that you can use for a lot of things. And we even split the project now in 2 parts. You have the software itself with all the communities and so on, and especially the software backend, the knowledge base and so on. And even the format is now standard by itself. So like that, if you build tools, so for example, if you're using tools for incident response, CM and so on, you can go to the MISP standard website, look at the format and all to do integration with tools. We have plenty of already existing tool set are integrating. I mean, a lot of tools are integrating with MISP, open source tools, but proprietary tools, some cloud services are integrating with MISP. So that's very versatile too. So if you're interested in contributing to the project, don't hesitate to go on GitHub. I think you have a lot of repository where people can contribute. Don't hesitate to ask questions. So we are super open regarding questions. So you can contact us by emails. If you want to follow up what we are doing on Twitter, go on the MISP project Twitter account. And really, if you want to test and do a dry test, you have a MISP virtual machine. You can just download it and test it. And I want to conclude on that, if you want to build your sharing communities for a specific use case and you don't know where to start, don't hesitate to send us an email. we are there to help. For us, really, the key point is not really the software itself and so on, but the key point is that people are sharing more to help the others. And that's really what we could help everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. While we're waiting for some questions from the chat, like congratulations for the great work and for MISP. Like you said, like it's pretty cool to see like how it had been used for like various projects now. And actually 2 weeks ago we had SJ to talk about the disinformation and the AMIT framework that they have been designing, and also they mentioned how it's being integrated in MISP now.
Yeah, the work they did is super cool because it's basically really reusing the building block of MISP to build something completely new for disinformations. That's really great.
Yeah, which is exactly like you said, right? Initially it was just for like software security, but threat intelligence is more than just like software security.
Exactly.
That's pretty cool. In the chat, we have Veronique who says that you have a great accent, easy to understand.
Yes, that's. I think for Veronique it's easier when you are French speaking to understand the French accent, for sure.
And do you guys have any question for Alex while he's here? And how automation are used in MISP setups
it's a good one. Yeah, it's a very good one. MISP, and that's something that we really, from the early beginning of MISP, we really want that people can use the dataset. So we have a REST search API where you can query anything you want in MISP and output in different formats. So it's pretty flexible. So you can output in JSON, CSV. You can generate, for example, Suricata, Bro rules, or Zeek rules directly from MISP. You can export like CSV and stuff like that, which make a lot of sense. But we have other integration scheme. We have real-time streaming too. So we basically have a 0MQ and a Kafka output in MISP. So you can basically integrate MISP to a real-time feed. There's a very good example from CERN in Geneva, where they basically built a complete stream of data, where they basically use MISP as a threat intelligence platform, and every data coming in is basically feeding all their systems, CM and so on. So for automation, you have different way of doing it. You can do push of data through API, that's a classical way of doing it, but you have integration of the 0MQ and so on to have real-time feed of data. Some vendors are integrating MISP by default. So for example, if you look at Splunk, for example, they have an app which is developed by another open source contributor, which is really cool. For some other vendors, you basically have built-in MISP integrations. So we are always eager to know about automations. If you look on the tools page of MISP project, you have a list of all automation aspects. So don't feel free to have a look at this. If something is missing or you know about new integration, just tell us and we can have a look at it.
Cool. Another question is MISP and Yeti.
That's a good one. And that's really as an open source project, we think that diversity is super important in the open source community. And we know people that are basically using MISP and Yeti together. For example, they use Yeti for more an analyst perspective, where the analyst is working for doing threat intelligence, as they interconnect it with MISP to do the sharing, for example. So for us, it's and I think it's the reality of our work. If you look at a SOC nowadays, you have like 25 or even 20 software that are basically connected together, from orchestrations, threat intelligence, and so on. So for us, it makes a lot of sense. And I mean, Yeti, for example, is a very good tool for analysts doing threat intelligence and so on, and interconnecting with MISP make a lot of sense. So that make a lot of sense for using it even in some communities and so on. So and for us, it's really important too. For example, with MISP, we have a lot of integration with other tools like the Hive, for example, which is another project for doing threat hunting. So for us, we always prefer to have basically tools that are really focused on doing something very well and with good integration, than having a tool that is basically not doing all the work properly.
Cool. And I guess that's that's it for today. I don't see more questions. Well, thanks again for joining us, Alex, and giving us a good summary of the journey of MISP and how it can also be used like in the future for like different groups. But and like you said, open source diversity is very important, and that's something like we need to see more. And well, interoperability also when there is diversity,
Exactly.
a key thing
Yes.
to not forget,
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much.
Cool. Well, thanks. And
Social distancing, you say? The future is watching. Welcome to Opcode Virtual Summit.
oh yeah, you can get ready, Juan. Cool. So next speaker now is going to be Juan, who is going to tell us how he found a new threat actor in some of the scripts that have been released like a few years back. So that should be pretty interesting. And yeah, so I'm just going to like launch the intro, and then we're going to move on.
Give me 1 second, Matt. I'm just trying to figure out some of the screen sharing. It's going a little.
Okay, no worries. But yeah, I hope you guys are having a good time. And like I said, if you have any questions, just drop in the chat. Don't hesitate. That's one of the main benefit of live streaming is if you have questions that you want to ask the speakers, you can just ask them, and you'll get an actual question. Without having to wait in a room of 1,000 people. To get the mic across the room. Thanks again for joining us today, and that should be a lot of fun. So we have a pretty good agenda today. Unfortunately, no, we don't have any presentation about the iOS mail client 0-day that everyone is talking about, but maybe we'll have something in 2 weeks. So if you know someone who wants to talk about it in 2 weeks, hopefully there is one skull cap game is on point.
That was better than me trying to cut my own hair at this point.
That's what streamers do. That's what they always wear, like a hat. They always have like a cap. I was thinking of doing it, and then I was like, well, you know what? Like it's like
I'm embracing my best streamer life right now. My Twitch life. Okay, can you see the screen?
Yes, I can. And let me do this, and I'm gonna launch the intro.
Okay.
Social distancing, you say? The future is watching. Welcome to Opcode Virtual Summit.
All right. So, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for showing up. Thanks for Matt for putting this together. It's a little weird for me to do sort of online webinar stuff. I've never really liked it, just because I miss having audience interaction. But I think we'll manage. We'll figure out the best way to handle this. I've been particularly vague with Matt about what I was going to present, but I figured that I could keep a few secrets in here and hopefully get to have a nice conversation with everybody and get to drop some interesting stuff. So, I call this something particularly vague, but I think it'll start to make sense. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Juan Andrés Guerrero Saade. I used to work with Kosten over at Great, and then had a nice stint over at Chronicle with the Uppercase research team. And I'm now off doing my own thing in a sort of stealthy way, and also have joined Thomas Ridd over at Johns Hopkins to do a little bit of academic work and hopefully teach a course this summer. The Grug is insisting that I say my name again. I'm just going to keep ignoring him. But in any case, I'm sort of being stealthy about what I'm doing for the time being, but I was hoping that I could still drop some research and hopefully keep things interesting for everybody as we sort of hunker down. So today, we're going to talk about something particularly interesting, at least to me, which is territorial dispute. For those of you that don't know what territorial dispute is, Kim Sutter wrote a great article about this back in 2018. Basically, as part of the Shadow Brokers dump, there were a couple of particularly interesting text files that got dumped that were meant to essentially help the equation group operators track different malware that might be on the boxes of the victims that they were cohabitating with. It was a matter of deconfliction. I've written a whole paper about deconfliction and some of the issues therein that you could look into. But in any case, there's this great story by Kim, and what it focuses on is really this paper. So I think Boldy, our beloved Boldy, or Dr. Boldasar Begsath from Crisis Lab, and his team wrote this paper back in 2018, which was a SAS talk about these small text files and essentially the number of sort of signatures and different atomic indicators that were pointing to all sorts of malware or potential malware or suspicious files that equation group operators or NSA operators were keeping track of up to about 2013, as far as we can tell. So there's a lot there, and I really do mean it. There's a lot there. I mean, Boldy did a great job at the time of what they had and identified a great deal of things, but there was a lot that they could not have possibly gotten to. And then as Kostin, as you might have seen in one of Kostin's tweets this morning, as Kostin mentioned, there's still a lot of stuff to be unpacked from here. There's also some work that was done, back with Silas Cutler and I were over at Chronicle. We were able to unearth a couple of things from here. Kaspersky's great team has also discovered a couple of things. So before rushing into just sort of dumping a new threat actor or something new to look at, I was hoping to kind of recap a little bit on some of the stuff that has already been found and some of the interesting observations therein that we might want to consider. So if my setup collaborates with me again, let's see. Oh, here we go. So, okay, here we go. So, here's some of the signatures. Basically, sigs.pi, which is the sort of main series of numbered signatures that these operators were looking for, has about 45 signatures in it. Some of them are redundant. Some of them are particularly sparse and almost impossible to keep, to dig in further on, because unlike any more sophisticated anti-malware solution, they basically were just looking for certain combinations of registry keys and file names, which isn't, it really isn't very much to dig on. It also is, of course, limited by the age of the visibility, which is, of course, we can't necessarily be expected to have a whole lot of data or heuristic data going back to 2010, 2011, 12, and so on. But there's a lot of recognizable names. Some of you might already have seen, Flame, Mini Flame, Flame, Sunflower, and Flower Shop relate to a lot of sort of the Gossip Girl super threat actor stuff that Silas Cutler and I worked on recently, which, you can find the video for the talk and a lot of other stuff. Papers and everything that we published, but there's also a lot of fun stuff in there, like Dark Hotel and Turla, Agent BTZ, Turtle, different versions of that, Animal Farm and Hydra Q, and so on. And then there's a few things that kind of stand out, like X4L and some of these question mark signatures that we were able to kind of discover other things on, but we're not going to go into that today. Maybe as opcodes continue, we can drop some tidbits off of different research. And the thing that I was hoping to focus on today is actually this signature, signature 37, which Crisis Lab team has identified as Iron Tiger. And I take some objections with, but we'll go into that in a second. So first of all, I wanted to discuss some of the things that have been identified since the Crisis Lab paper came out. And the first thing that I have to give a lot of credit for, because it's super impressive, was this signature 27 discovery by Kaspersky's great team, where they figured out that it was actually something that they called dark universe, or more importantly, a new set of activity or a previously undiscovered set of activity related to Itaduke, a particularly interesting threat actor, not a part of the sort of Russian cloud of dukes, as some folks might assume from the name. It's actually just an unfortunate sort of combination, I believe, between the fact that there were some Italian terms and, I believe the same exploit was used as some of the dukes at the time. I'm sure Kosin could tell you the story better than I can. But in any case, it's a Duke-related framework called Dark Universe, particularly interesting. You can find the report on SecureList. I thought that was a super cool finding that I think highlights the importance of still looking back on some of these signatures and not assume that just because they're old, we have full coverage of whatever's going on there. If anything, we're at a place to kind of test ourselves and figure out if we as threat intelligence providers have been keeping up with at least some partial amount of the visibility that SIGINT giants seem to have. Another thing that I wanted to point out is actually the driver list. The driver list file, which is also pointed out by the Crisis Lab report, is particularly interesting, but it has not really gotten quite as much attention as you might expect. So I wanted to kind of point this one out. I think driver list file, I probably should have included a bigger screenshot here, but in any case, the driver list file, what's interesting about it is it's just meant to point out names of kernel drivers alongside instructions for what the operator should do if and when they encounter this on a box that they're on. And I think that that's particularly interesting, considering that you can see some of the internal classifications for this file. So part of the reason that I say that it's so significant is if you think about how the Shadow Brokers leak worked, a lot of the context and the ability to describe what was going on there came from the fact that, Great had already discovered the equation group back in 2015 and published on it. So they were benefiting from having context already out there. Otherwise, equation group toolkit, super massive, a lot of different, very intricate pieces, takes a lot of work to reverse engineer, to get through, to hunt through. And I'm pretty sure there's still a lot of it that has been discovered since 2015 that it still has not been publicly detailed. So it would have been actually quite difficult, I think, for the Shadow Brokers to convey their message without having that context. However, had they been particularly conservative, I think that just dropping the driver list file would have actually been enough to burn a significant portion of the equation group toolkit. And the reason that I say that is you can actually see a lot of the file names for some of the kernel components of the equation group stuff alongside NSA cryptonyms, which I think is particularly tough, but also very interesting for anybody who's trying to kind of correlate this activity and understand how some of the leaks and some of the independently private sector discovered components actually correlate. There's some interesting stuff in here that you can see from some of the original reports alongside some of these file names and of course some of the versioning. And you can go sort of play academic and write a fairly interesting thesis, I think, between all the stuff that's been made public and all the stuff that was sort of independently discovered in time, right? Whether it's Anti's report or Kaspersky or some of the other folks that have waded in there. Other stuff that I think is particularly interesting is some of the understanding of how some of these threat actors know one another or might be aware of one another. One particular case is in the driver list. There's sort of a description of what they refer to as friendly tools, which are significant in that they're different from things that seem to have internal, code names. So in this particular case, this mnmdf.sys is actually correlates to Gold Lambert, which I think is, sort of an interesting threat actor in its own right. There's also another instance of this same sort of friendly tool that correlates to another component of Gold Lambert. But there's also some nuances there. They're not aware of other components of the Lambert's toolkit. So there's conversations to be had about sort of the complexities and nuances of how different threat actors, even within, maybe the same alliances or same countries, are aware of one another. And of course, I've written on some of this stuff. You can go read a fairly dry and boring academic paper about it. And then I think that there's still some mysteries within the driver list. This one is one that I'm particularly fond of. And, you know, maybe if my Black Hat talk ends up going through, which I suspect might not happen, I'll get to drop some of this. Otherwise, maybe Matt might have me back, or we'll find some other forum to discuss some of the more interesting stuff. You can see a brief flash of, you know, my latest tattoo honoring some of these findings. I like to wear them on my sleeve. So, okay, let's focus on the new stuff, right? So that was sort of a whirlwind tour of everything that's happening with territorial dispute and TEDI and so on. And it's particularly interesting, I think, as a social phenomenon and as just a general sort of understanding of threat actors behind the scenes. But that's not what everybody's here for, I would imagine. So let's talk about something a little more concrete and hopefully newer. So Signature 37 is discussed as or described as Iron Tiger or ASPX spy. If you look at what Signature 37 originally entails, it's really quite this simple. It's just godown.dll as an atomic indicator, just the name of a file. And you can understand how that is a particularly sparse indicator, but thankfully in this case, it's a fairly unique file name. So it is something to dig on. Now, the reasoning behind Crisis Lab pointing to Iron Tiger or ASPX spy for Signature 37 is this particular file from VirusTotal that they included in their report. And I imagine that, you know, they mustn't have had a great deal of time to dig into quite so many operations. So no fault to Crisis Lab on this one. But in this case, I think that the identification is wrong. If you look at what that particular file is on VirusTotal, you can see right away there's a couple of things that kind of should tell some of the more seasoned threat hunters that this isn't a particularly good lead to go on. For one, the file name sort of indicating that this is some kind of dump, memory dump, and also that, you know, it's a massive file. 15 megabytes for an executable is quite big. But also, if you're particularly astute, you can also catch the fact that, you know, the file name starts with mcshield.exe. To me, that looks like maybe somebody was trying to dump some of the signature or basis for McAfee's antivirus and might have stumbled upon some things there. So what the dump ends up doing is, if you look at the community comments, someone, Venom23, I think that might be Florian Roth, I'm not entirely sure, had matched this under an Iron Tiger ASPX spy rule and, you know, sort of auto-commented that onto the VT community section. And I suspect that, you know, Crisis Lab folks sort of took that to the report as they didn't necessarily have a lot of time to dig into it. However, this is a false positive insofar as while the rule might be right and it might be matching a binary that includes those indicators, that same binary includes tons of indicators because it's actually based on a series of antivirus bases that were sort of taken out of context of McAfee installer. And that includes the godown.dll file name, but this is not, you know, what we should be looking at. This actually does not identify the cluster of activity we should be looking at here. So let's go back, you know, to the drawing board, go back to scratch, just, you know, throw out that notion that it might be Iron Tiger or Lucky Mouse or Emissary Panda or whoever, and instead just go right back to godown.dll and start hunting fresh. So when we do that, we actually are able to narrow in on a different set of files. And as you can see here from, you know, from VT, this is sort of entirely undetected, DLL. This one in particular shows up a couple of years ago, but in general, the activity is much older than that. And is sort of a promising lead for us to kind of kick off on. When we start digging deeper into this particular DLL, what we find is something I think particularly interesting. Obviously, a sort of self-description of this go down module, hence the name of the talk. In reality, there's a lot of sort of weird comm stuff that's happening with this particular DLL. And as we start hunting on some of these and some of these particular SIDs and some of the stuff on the screen right now, writing some YARA rules and so on, what we dig out onto is actually a much larger cluster of activity. And not just the go down DLL, but rather go down DLL as a drop from a multi-stage framework that's been sort of built by this threat actor. It starts with this gpupdates.exe. In reality, this is a SIP to secure executable, which is sort of this Chillcat application from back in the day that you could essentially basically tell it to pack all these things for you and place them where they needed to be and execute a particular smaller exe that would take care of placing all these different things and executing things for you. So in reality, gpupdates.exe is the first stage that includes all this other stuff. You can see the configuration here from SIP to secure, where it's basically telling it encrypt all this stuff, decrypt it when you execute, and pull out this distribute.exe that's really just going to distribute all the components onto the system. And then some particular things that interestingly happen there. There's a lot of sort of registration of these different DLLs as these OLE services in the system. For some of you that are being particularly astute, you can start to tell that this is targeting some fairly old versions of Windows. More on that in a bit. And then there's a sort of main orchestrator, which is being made persistent as a Windows service called EY service. Of course, it has its own fake description and all this interesting stuff to hopefully not arouse suspicion. The components that are being dropped and that are being used in the process are a series of DLLs. Some of them are just straight up commodity stuff or really commonly available resources that are being, I don't know whether they're being abused or reused. Some of them are obviously being abused, like the first one, that lame ENC. It's really a UPX packed version of the MP3 library. Or basically your standard MP3 or WAV library. It's just been UPX packed and thrown in there. Interestingly, they're repurposing that to use that for the purposes of turning on a hot mic. There's also what seems to be a slightly more popular keylogger that they're including in there. They're also abusing this sort of strange bitmap creation DLL from some kind of gaming forums to actually take screenshots, which I think is quite creative, but also sort of an interestingly crappy level of development at the same time. And yet, you see those first three components where you clearly go, well, this isn't a very sophisticated or capable threat actor or developer involved. And yet you see some of the file management stuff is actually being done in this strange type library way, and so is the command and control stuff. So I think if you're looking for some of the more sophisticated components of this, or some of the more interesting components of this, svchost.exe, go down DLL, and filesystem.dll seem to include some new tricks, while at the same time they're packing some fairly old and wonky stuff that they're using to do new stuff. Most of the control is going on in this sort of very convoluted, ginormous switch statement that just takes about 17 or 18 numbered commands, which then orchestrate all sorts of different functionality. As you can tell, some of the stuff is not fully implemented here. There's definitely a certain level of development. I say as you can tell. I mean, for those of you that are very staring at the screen quite intently, you can still see that there are about 3 or 4 different commands that haven't been implemented. You might also be able to tell that I'm not a fantastic reverser either. So there are still a lot of mysteries in here that I encourage any of you with greater skill to take the time and go into. Moreover, I haven't even been able to properly parse out the IP that it's using for command and control because it just stumps me. So feel free to go in there and do some proper debugging. And I think you'll find some things that I've yet to find. Among those, I think if I can encourage others to get involved in the research and get interested, I think that there's some particular oddities. First and foremost, there's this sort of type library com control weirdness that they're doing with the go down and file system DLLs. I say that it's weirdness because I've actually not seen anything similar implemented in other or malware descriptions so far. So it does seem to be like they're doing some strange, sort of ActiveX COM type library strangeness in order to control some of these components. There's also another component that gets dropped further on, which is a particularly curious choice of packet sniffer. So if you look at some of the functionality deeper down, they're dropping this thing called psSDK41.vxd or .sys. And that's actually this old school microlab packet sniffer SDK driver, which is actually sort of a precursor to TCP dump. And I point out sort of that I think it's particularly interesting within the context of Teddy because it's also included within the driver list file, as I had mentioned. So once again, I think that this is a piece of malware that was found sort of in the wild, in the field, and had already been deployed. And if you look at the driver list file, once again, you actually see a series of other names for other versions of the same packet sniffer. And sort of, I got a little curious and started sort of digging around on some of these. And it turns out that some of the other versions actually correlate to other versions of this go down malware, or what I refer to as the Nazar APT. If you look at psSDK 3.1 instead of the 4.1 we were looking at, we've actually found at least one other sample from 2010 that is dropping that version of the packet sniffer. So it seems like, at least for some of the operations that the equation group, operators were running into or conflicting with, there might have been a tree of development or development over time that they had been able to witness in the wild. Now, of course, what everybody wants to know when it comes to these things is, what's the attribution? I'm fairly attribution agnostic, though I don't really want to parse terms or just sort of tiptoe around anything. So let's just present some of the tiny fragments and tidbits that we can put in there. And I'm sure that people with greater visibility will be able to put things together in a more interesting way going forward. But first and foremost, and I think this is the most important part from the perspective of sort of threat intel research, rather than attribution, clustering, I've been unable to cluster this to any publicly reported group so far. Of course, if it is something that can be connected to some other group, fantastic, please let us know. For the time being, I haven't been able to do it, which I think again validates the importance of going back to some of these old scriptures, if you will, and still try to compare notes and try to figure out what mysteries we've yet to uncover. In this particular case, I can at least say that it's a previously undiscovered cluster of activity. Who knows if it's connected to anything else? Now, for the kind of stuff that people like, there are some debug resources that have been left in there, including some Farsi resources and some of the droppers and some of the go down DLLs themselves. Also, a debug path, which I think is particularly interesting for this particular term that you could see as sort of the root path. So I went ahead and I asked some friends that are native Farsi speakers and who might be able to help. And what they pointed me to was this KHZER as a transliteration of the term Nazar. And Nazar, has several meanings, but it could be taken either as to survey or to monitor. More practically, it's also the name for some of these sort of evil eye protection amulets, which I particularly liked. So that's why I'm referring to this threat actor or this cluster of activity as the Nazar APT. And it might also be the first APT that actually has an emoji already set within your iOS keyboard. So, if you feel like chatting on it, that's particularly useful. Now, another thing that I think is particularly interesting is that the victims appear to be exclusively within Iran. At first, lacking any visibility of my own, I was sort of basing myself on the fact that the most perfect drop versions of the orchestrator payload were exclusively submitted from Iranian machines to VirusTotal, which I will be the first person to tell you is not a good way to do victimology. So I wasn't going to mention that at all. However, two collaborators that will remain nameless for the time being have actually pointed me at some of their own visibility and been able to share that there were exclusively victims in Iran. And interestingly, and I say this particularly because the malware is so old and it targets such old versions of Windows, Windows XP and down, there's still a few victims beaconing out of Iran for this. So I think it's particularly interesting. I say that it's particularly interesting since we're discussing attribution because, whenever anybody talks about Iran as an attacker, we start to think about sort of Western victims and all the things that we've seen with your usual oil rig ops or, whatever. Trying to think, the name has literally escaped me at this time. I was thinking Rasgas and Saudi Aramco, but Kostin will be able to correct me for not remembering the name in this particular moment. In any case, whenever we think about Iranian APTs, we tend to think sort of Western targeting. Whenever we think about Iranian targeting, we tend to think sort of Western APTs. In this particular case, if we were to take all of the attributed indicators at face value, it sort of defies that general perception insofar as looking at what may be an Iranian-born cluster of activity targeting what looks like exclusively Iranian victims. But of course, please, take that all with the 10 spoonfuls of salt that it requires under the circumstances. That said, it's not something entirely beyond the pale. You could look at something like Ator, for example, on other sort of domestic surveillance toolkits as a sort of particularly interesting trend there. So there is some precedent for it, but I'm just saying it's sort of based on very sparse data, so I don't necessarily want to harp on that in particular. Now, the whole point of this is to arouse sort of the interest of other researchers. I really mean this. I'm very fortunate in my personal life. There's a lot of different new ventures and things going on that I'm focused on, that I'm very excited about. But it also means that despite being locked within my home, I don't necessarily have all the time in the world, and I definitely don't have all the visibility in the world to take on this kind of work with the kind of sort of full-time focus that I think it deserves. So the whole point of this is not just to show off, but rather to show off and hopefully arouse the interest of other researchers to get involved and dig in and see, a new cluster of activity and hopefully feel motivated to jump in. So for those of you that are interested, well, you're going to have to badger me a bit because I have every intention of publishing this on my blog, but I am still finishing the draft today. And, if you don't see it by the end of the day, please feel free to harass me on Twitter. But I have every intention of publishing YARA rules and IOCs and everything that you'll need to sort of trace some of my steps and hopefully find some stuff of your own. In particularly, any particularly skilled reversers, please jump in, figure out what the packet sniffer is doing in particular, figure out what some of this other functionality within the 17, 18 other commands within that switch statement are that I've yet to document fully, and figure out what this type library com technique is that I have not figured out and that I don't think has been publicly reported so far. So yeah, sky's the limit. You're absolutely welcome to contribute. Again, epicturla.com, it'll eventually be there. Please feel free to badger me for it. And that is that. So I don't know if there have been comments in the chat. I've tried not to read. I find the Grug and Kostin just distracting enough on the chat here in the speaker's room. But I don't know if Matt wants to come out with any questions. I'm just trying not to look. I'm trying not to get too distracted, as I go through the slides. But I'm getting phone calls. There's several chats going on, text messages. I'm all over the place. All of the stuff that I put forward is on VirusTotal. I have not checked in Teaser or Malshare or VirusBay or any of the other that are available at this time. If anybody wants to extend any particular access to me as an academic and independent researcher right now, they're more than welcome to. I do believe Malshare has a lot of the samples already, which is great initiative on the part of Silas Cutler. But yes, all of the samples that I have mentioned and will mention are on VirusTotal. So there's no excuse apart from, basic access to VT not to look at the stuff.
And another question was, are you going to share all the hashes and bytes? I guess it's going to be in your blog post, right? The one you're finishing now, right?
It will be on my blog post. Again, feel free to badger me if you don't see it by the end of the day. I've just been polishing up the draft. I think having Kostin as a mentor has forced me to be a little more discerning about my own writing, and it's starting to get in my way because I'm just not publishing. So I need to maybe sit back and just dump the blog post already. But yeah, there will be hashes and there will be Yara rules as well.
And well, another question from Kostin was, is this like SIG37 stuff related to Voyeur?
I am not entirely certain. I did not find any immediate correlation, but I didn't focus on Voyeur in particular. So I'm happy to discuss it further.
Okay.
Also, let me just say, for people who do decide to kind of jump in on this, I'll more than happily update the blog and refer to everybody else's work. I'm just trying to kind of throw the inkling out there for others to go hunting, since I don't think anybody's caught on to this activity yet.
Okay. And another question from Devetel was, is this GoDropper friendly to equation group or not?
It is not. So the interesting division here is stuff that's in the driver list is all mixed up. It includes equation tools, it includes equation friendly tools, it includes unknown tools, it includes what they call PSPs, or personal security products. So, McAfee, Kaspersky, and so on. It even includes things like Nero from back in the day. I think this is a sort of pre-kernel driver code signing paradigm where they were just sort of scared of the possibility of any rootkit cohabitating with them. Mm-hmm. So the driver list just includes everything. On the other hand, the numbered signatures, as far as we can tell, are exclusively, other, I won't say enemy APTs, because there's others that you might consider Western friendlies, like, Animal Farm. But they are definitely separate clusters of activity that include sort of, your usual Russians and, South Koreans, North Koreans, and so on. So I expect signature 37 to be one that they were keeping track of, not one that they were keeping part of.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, because some of the files were DRV files, right?
Sorry?
Some of the files were DRV files, which is like, I haven't seen any of that in a long time.
Yeah, they had some XVD stuff in there. It's old school too. The activity, as far as I can tell, is centered somewhere between 2010 to 2013. But there's definitely also several versions of development, and all the samples that I've seen have gone from some portion of incompleteness to some lesser portion of incompleteness. So I expect this activity to have continued to go on, which is why I'm particularly interested to see what others will find as they go forward, because I don't think that this has subsided. If anything, this is a super old school version. I'm sure there've got to be some, Vista and forward Windows versions.
Yeah, very likely. Well, thanks for joining us today and for your presentation. It was really cool. And if you cannot make it to Black Hat, we'll be more than happy to have you here. I've seen DEF CON is already talking about being cancelled. So, maybe it's time to for people to get ready to alternatives.
Yeah, I appreciate the forum.
Actually, there's one more question from Dave. Wait, does have a real rootkit in here or just the sniffer driver?
There is no rootkit in here. It's all userland stuff, except for the packet sniffer. Yes.
Okay. Cool. Well, thanks again. And talk to you soon.
Thanks, man.
So yeah, well, I hope you guys are having a good time. And just a quick announcement. So as a joke, I sent a message to John McAfee to know if he wanted to give the keynote in a month. So I got an answer, but the problem is they said I need to have like 5,000 subscribers. I'm not even joking to get more subscribers. But that's actually what he said, you know. Otherwise, he will not show up on the thing. So I'm just saying, if people want to subscribe, that's actually it's a good excuse. You know, that would be quite funny. Maybe we can convince Greg to do like an OPSEC and privacy, like a roundtable with him. But yeah, without further ado, we're gonna be getting ready for our next panel about vulnerability disclosure. Like I was saying at the beginning, the goal is for it to not be boring. So I know it's quite a boring topic in general. And so if you have any interesting questions, like you're more than happy to drop them. And yeah, we'll get ready now.
Social distancing, you say? The future is watching. Welcome to OpCode Virtual Summit.
Let's get ready. Yeah, and we are live now.
Hello. This is the panel on responsible disclosure or irresponsible disclosure. And we've got Costin and Casey. Costin is from Kaspersky Great, which he is. And Casey is, of course, from Bug Crowd and Australia. You'll want to introduce yourself, Costin?
Yeah, sure. Thanks again for having me at OpCode. The second time for me. I was also supposed to be participating in the real OpCode a couple of times, I guess, in Abu Dhabi. And I found ways to excuse myself, sadly, but now I'm back. I'm the director of the Global Research and Analysis team at Kaspersky. And to be honest, although the title sounds more like boring management, I like to do a lot of research. I'm kind of hands down kind of a guy. I like to do a lot of research, writing Yara rules, looking at things such as 637 that one amazingly talked about. And I used to do some exploit development like a long time ago, including vulnerability disclosure back in the days and a bit of it also more recently. And I'm, of course, very happy to be here with you guys to speak about this.
Cool. And Casey?
Yeah, morning, everyone. Yeah, sure thing. So, yeah, just as the background suggests, I am in Australia right now. I'm normally in San Francisco, but we had decided to bug out down here ahead of the whole COVID thing. So we're here until we can go back. But yeah, I'm the founder, chairman, and CTO of BugCrowd. I've been in security, pretty much since high school and kind of transitioning into that, more from a pen test kind of hacking standpoint at that point in time. Moved across into the called the dark side of solutions and kind of the more front end of the business set of things in about 2010. And then, that got it in my head that I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I think the thing with BugCrowd was really the idea of like, how do we connect, like this is a people problem, getting security research, getting security feedback. We're talking about technology, but it's fundamentally a people problem. Like vulnerabilities are the product of things that get decided in certain ways that end up being weak. And bad guys are motivated by human incentive. So how do we get more people into the mix to help with getting ahead of that stuff and making things more secure? And I think as a part of that, BugCrowd spawned out basically a standardization project called the vulnerability open source vulnerability disclosure policy framework, which is now Disclose.io. And the whole idea behind that is like, how can we just make this normal? How can we make it so that security research isn't needing to be done with one eye over the shoulder to see if someone's going to have a problem with it, legally or from a commercial standpoint. And how do we get all of that stuff out there? So yeah, I've been waiting around in this space for quite a long time, and good to be here.
Cool. Right. So I'll be honest, I'm a little bit surprised why we have to have this panel, because I thought that disclosure was solved in the 90s.
All fixed. Yeah, total.
Yeah. So, I mean, why is it still going on? Why has this not been solved? So, Casey, I guess.
Yeah, for sure.
Any-
Yeah, look, I mean, the thing that we've seen happen, like, yeah, the thing that Bugcrowd needed to deal with back in 2012 was this sort of pervasive idea that a hacker was automatically a bad person, and that was very much kind of the dominant view that people had at that point in time, and that's I think since shifted. I don't think it's not a problem now, but it's definitely not the same as it was back at that point in time. So that's good. That was when a lot of the, responsible versus coordinated versus all our other stuff was going on. And we kind of got, mostly over that hump, which is a good thing. But now I think it's frankly, it's an awkward conversation. There's still a hell of a hangover from the idea of scary hackers, like even down to, some of the risk around election disinformation right now. I'd put more of that down to the fact that like a non-technical user is worried about getting hacked, even though they don't know what it means. There's still this kind of fear of the unknown. And I think very practically speaking, it's an awkward conversation. Like if you're not prepared to get feedback that your stuff's broken, the first time that happens, it does tend to be quite a confronting thing for an organization or an individual to go through. So there's all these like versions of that are happening for the first time. And I think the reason that it's still a conversation is that not everyone's done it yet. I don't think everyone's like moved onto the front foot to say, okay, we need to be able to hear from the internet. And I don't think everyone's actually experienced that yet. So in the absence of there being a common experience and a common kind of like, yeah, let's do this, let's do it this way, you end up with things getting broken sometimes.
Right. Okay. So I guess what would Disclose.io be bringing to the table for that? Because it seems like if you're saying that there's not a broadly accepted framework that's adopted.
Yeah. I mean, for sure. Go ahead.
It's just like, this is not the first framework that's come out. So, why are you different than any of the 20 other ones that we've had before?
Yeah, totally. It's like we've got a problem with 99 frameworks, so let's create another one, and now we've got a problem with 100 frameworks. The idea with Disclose.io is two things. One is to collapse and simplify everything. Like one of the big things with briefs, like vulnerable disclosure briefs and bug bounty briefs and all that stuff, is that half the time people don't read that shit anyway. Especially some of the newer hunters that are coming into the space. Like they just want to see that there's some sort of permission there, and then once they've seen that, they'll just go. Obviously, you want to try to educate and have people, actually go through and be careful. But in practice, that's not going to happen 100% of the time. So how can you simplify? I think the thing that's different about the language that we put up is it's actually quite short. Like what we tried to do was to balance this idea of legal completeness with readability for people that are like English as a second language, or like that aren't native to the language that brief's been written in. But not at the full expense of it being as legally complete as it can be. So that's one side of it. I think the other side that we've really doubled down on since we kind of relaunched the thing as Disclose.io and started to make it its own kind of collective is this idea of like safe harbor and the idea of, the existing legal frameworks around hacking still having been constructed before the concept of good faith. The CFAA was literally a product of Ronald Reagan going and watching war games and freaking out and asking the DOJ to come up with a solution for it. It hasn't really changed much since then. So the idea of there being a locksmith as well as a burglar, I think, is better recognized by like our community. It's better recognized by the industry, but the law doesn't reflect that. So that's probably another difference, is that we've really focused on making sure that in the absence of that being better constructed, and in lieu of it changing at some point in the future, how do we create carve-outs to make sure that this stuff is safe?
All right, that's pretty good. I want to shoot back to the 90s for a minute because, apparently,
A good decade.
Yeah, we had the best clothes.
Absolutely.
Things that have aged very, very poorly. 90s cool. Basically back in the day, we did have all of these disclosure debates, and we did come out with, our set of base assumptions. And, those of us who have been around for a while, when new people are joining the debate, we get very frustrated that, we did this in 95. Where were you guys? Oh, you weren't born yet. Well, anyway, so what I'm wondering is, are we wrong in that everything we need to know we got in the 90s, or has anything what's changed since then? Do we need to update our assumptions that we established? And I'm going to throw that to Costin because he looks bored.
Yeah, Costin. No, I'd love to hear.
Well, as Casey was talking, I was thinking about that more specifically, how things were in the 90s. And I guess that one way to describe this vulnerability disclosure is pretty much it feels like it's a bit like rediscovering the wheel. And I think that a lot of companies are going through this process of rediscovering the wheel, and the process probably has a couple of steps. The first step is always denial. There's if you remember those PC Mac adverts from more than 10-15 years ago, it was like first thing they say is we don't have any vulnerabilities, our products are super secure, we have no bugs. That's the denial phase. There's nothing of sorts. The next level after denial is when somebody actually starts up to come up with problems. They are trying the legal way, trying to sue the guys, trying to shut them down, to buy them off, and all sorts. And to be honest, this is still happening, by the way. And the next step from there, I guess, is acknowledgements, but still no, let's say, incentives for people, no incentives, so not just that, but no special steps to make it safer and easier for independent researchers to do that. And probably the next step from there is the bug bounty programs, where there's actual financial incentives. And I do remember 97. In 97, or people don't remember those times, it was the launch of Windows NT version 4 by Microsoft. I think it happened 1 year before. So there were a lot of discussions around the security of Windows NT 4. It was a guy by the name of Konstantin Sobolev who came up with an exploit called getadmin. And I think that exploit was probably used by a lot of hackers out there for many, many years because it was just so solid and reliable to just get administrative access. And Microsoft patched it. I think they released this patch with SP3, but also they had a kind of a hotfix. So back in the days, I was spending a lot of time with Softice, if you guys remember that debugging software. Debugging kernel crashes. So it took me a couple of hours just to find another vulnerable function in Windows 32 cases. I wrote an exploit for there that would just do the same thing as getadmin. So I confirmed that actually it can be exploited very easily. And I sent an email to Microsoft about it. And there was pretty much nothing happening. No reply, no acknowledgement. I sent another one, and I think it was another one. And there was absolutely like nothing, complete silence. Then after a while, there was like the patch for the bug that I reported without like anything, no acknowledgement, no nothing. And it was kind of frustrating. So I decided to drop the exploit on NTSec, and from there was forwarded to Bugtrack by Aleph. And well, obviously it became public. There was definitely irresponsible disclosure. So if we judge it by the norms that we have nowadays, I guess it's kind of irresponsible because, well, there was no communication, no coordination involved. But the frustration was also big. It was funny that after a while I got an email from Microsoft and they said, "Hey man, thanks for reporting this. And by the way, can we send you something like a hat or a T-shirt for reporting it?" And I said, "Sure." Well, would be nice to get a hat or T-shirt, but would be even nicer if I can get something like Visual C++ 2.0 or something like this. There was still like $100 back in the days. Was a big fortune. It was quite nice. They actually sent me that. But I guess, and that this brings me to my point. We used to have a consultant in the company, an American consultant in our company. I used to work for a different company. He came to me in regards to this story, and he asked me something which I thought was so stupid. And he said, "So you reported this bug to Microsoft?" I said, "Yes." And he asked me, "Did you ask them for money?" And I was like, "What? To ask them for money to report a bug doesn't make sense." It seemed like a completely stupid idea, but I guess nowadays this is also kind of an important thing in the whole equation of vulnerability disclosure, incentivizing people to look into these things, part of the whole ecosystem. I think bug bounties are also important. But yeah, going back to the 90s, it felt like that.
Yeah, it's interesting you call it out at the end there, because I think, like, I clearly, given what we do, I agree on the incentive side of it. I think one of the downsides to it has been that there's a very blurry definition between like a vulnerability disclosure program, a bug bounty program, which in my mind is a vulnerability disclosure program where rewards have been added to all or part of the scope. And then this concept of like crowdsourced security, where things are being done privately and all of that. Like, when we got going, is the back end of 2012, and it was just started. Like the concept of bug bounties was just starting to bubble up in the valley, and then it caught this huge tailwind at the back of 2013 as a bunch of players jumped in. Like it was partly our doing, partly other platforms kind of coming online and starting up, and then partly some of the larger programs that kind of joined in at that point. And Microsoft was one of them, because that was quite a, oh, wow, okay, I didn't think you guys would do it type of moment, at which point it got kind of topical, which is great, as I said, for getting folk over the hump of like, hackers aren't necessarily all bad. Like some of us are actually, able to do stuff that's helpful as well, like get past that thing. But the downside of it that I think we're dealing with now is that this is conflation of all of these different concepts and under this one banner. It's like, oh, that's a bug bounty program. No, it's disclosure. It's responsible, coordinated-ish. It's got NDAs on it, so that's wrong. And the whole thing just gets all kind of muddy because it hasn't been laid out. So that's something that, frankly, it's a challenge for all of us in the space. I think it's a challenge for a lot of the people that are actually operating these programs as well. And there's a lot of stuff being done to try to disambiguate that. I think going back to Greg's question on the digital natives and the digital boomers of vulnerability disclosure in that sense, I completely agree. Like there's the thing that we see where I actually think there's a lot that can be learned in both directions. Like the newer folk, like I always believe that's true just as a general kind of life principle, but like the newer folk learning from the younger folk. Since this has become so much more accessible and there is this financial incentive tied to bounties, what we've seen is this like influx of net new folk, a chunk of which are talented, a chunk of which want to be and aren't yet, but they're all keen to get involved and do something. And they don't realize how hard it's been for folk in our generation from this standpoint. It's like what that nets out to is the amount of user empathy that you've got as a vulnerability reporter. Like you're sitting there saying, okay, I understand a little bit better because I've skinned my knees. I've potentially had to deal with like angry lawyers or PR people or even the law itself. Like I actually understand like the criticality of the conversation that we're trying to have here, and I've got some empathy in how I operate because of that. Like the newcomers don't tend to have that because they just think that it's how it should work. it can kind of equate to an entitlement, which I think around this particular subject actually becomes dangerous pretty quickly. So that's one of the areas where.
What's the difference between a vulnerability disclosure out of nowhere with a request for a bug bounty and extortion?
Exactly.
Like that was something that we were very aware of back in the day, but now, people, like they seem to think that it's just normal to get paid.
Yeah, well, and it can still be extortion. Like there's cases where that's actually been used as a mask for extortion. So, I think we're far from normalizing it. Definitely where the trends are kind of shaking out is starting to become fairly clear. But in terms of it being like a consensus driven or a standardized thing, I don't think we're quite there yet.
Yeah. So, somewhat related to that, it's, even though bug bounties are now much bigger and, there is this very large population of people who've been, I guess, brought up with the idea of disclosure by default. We're still finding 0 days in the wild. Today there was the iOS mail exploit that got, didn't get dropped, but we found out about it. There's been the Zoom 0 days that are apparently being sold for $500,000, and I can tell you one thing: they're not being bought for $500,000. I'm wondering, maybe how do you think bug bounties are failing in addressing these sort of more high-end big targets? Is it that Apple doesn't have a bug bounty, or Zoom hasn't had one?
That's I think it's a pretty interesting question and point of view here, and I think that you've previously talked about this as well from some people who are saying, like, we can do, I have a 0 day, I can do two things with it. I can either report it to the vendor, to Apple, whatever, it gets a small amount of money and get it fixed. Or I can sell it through reputable sources, reputable channels where I know it's used by the good guys, and make maybe 10 times more. And what are the ethics here, and which one is the better course? I guess there's also, by the way, there's also people out there for sure who do both. So how do you build up like a reputation? And maybe you also have a lot of experience with building up the reputation. But let's say that not me, but maybe someone who is completely unknown wants to sell some 0 days through some of these high stakes buyers. Basically nobody knows him. And one way is just to start by getting into a couple of advisories, maybe from Microsoft, from these big companies. You see his name, and then people recognize his name, and that obviously makes it much easier for him to move to the other game. But for sure, there is this huge gap between the bug bounties that vendors are paying and the money that you can get from selling it to
this one exactly. This one comes up a lot, and I think there's a couple of things. Like there isn't necessarily a viable or an active offensive acquisition market for a lot of the organizations that have launched bug bounty programs over the past 5 6 years, for example. Like Apple, Google, like Microsoft, Adobe. Okay, they make sense to go off and buy exploits for if you're trying to do offensive work. Like if you're talking about platform providers, for example, that's probably not as sensible, because ultimately oftentimes the bug is being fixed in one place, at which point it's gone. So if you start exploiting it, or if you're trying to use it in a campaign that's identified, there's a fix, the time to live on the product you've created from that vulnerability is short, which to me means the value of it is comparatively lower, right? Zoom is obviously an interesting one in this, because I think a lot of the attention on them is kind of a function of the fact that they 10x'd overnight, which is not something that happens every day. but they're somewhat of an outlier, I think, in the equation here. But really, what it comes down to is that Apple do have a defensive acquisition program, and there's pricing that gets passed all over the internet on the cost of an iOS chain on any given day. And it usually, what I've noticed is it tends to run at about a third. What we've seen when there isn't an offensive competitor for a bug is that it tends to run more like a fifth or so. And the main reason is that the point of value for defensive acquisition is when the information goes from point A to point B. Like once the person who owns the product knows about the bug, that's pretty much it. They can go in and get some more detail or whatever, collaborate with the researcher, but it's gone from unknown to known at that point, and that's the point of value. Whereas in the offensive space, like you've got to take it, weaponize it, you've got to build your business model around it in whatever form that takes. The value chain that's created persists beyond that transit of the knowledge of the bomb from A to B. So there are some pretty interesting kind of quirks to the deltas in the actual economics of it, and that whole area is really interesting, I think.
Yeah. So I mean, there's a few things that came up there that we should address. One, I think, is how Apple has moved to make it harder to actually do security research on their platform. They've got the lawsuit against Corellium, and their alternative to that was supposed to be these special security research devices, but those aren't being shipped. I've been asking for months, and I don't know anyone that has received one. So Apple seems to be no, they're not actually a good faith participant, maybe. Another thing is the difference between defensive and offensive markets, which Casey covered fairly well, but I guess there's a bit more to talk about there. And then the third thing is, again, something Casey just lightly mentioned on, is how historically we've had the situation where people have had applications. So there'll be thousands of people who are vulnerable and thousands of people who need to patch. Now we have web apps where thousands of people are vulnerable, but only one company needs to patch. So anyone who wants to address any of those three issues.
Austin, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this one, because this is
well, again, there's so many things and so many points of view with pretty much all these different things. Another thing that I was thinking about, by the way, as we were talking about, and I see there's a question in the chat also, or somehow related. Yeah, Dave Vaitel is asking a lot of tricky questions. But I've seen somebody else also ask about if somebody has ever been prosecuted for discovering or selling 0 days and under what law. And I do remember two kind of cases that we can give as an example. I remember there was a case of a Turkish exploit developer that was selling them, and he got in trouble and probably is still in jail at the moment. I apologize, I can't remember his name at the moment. The other kind of interesting case is the one of Vitaly Toropov, who became, let's say, kind of famous after the hacking team hack, when his name became public as an exploit seller. He was selling to hacking team, and a lot of his vulnerabilities, let's say, they had a certain feeling. You could kind of guess which one were his exploits from the code. And we noticed something interesting is that after that story, Vitaly Toropov, well, he was based in Russia. He had like one of these, let's say, income tax profiles. So basically, someone could do research on how much money he was making and so on, because he tried to do it, I guess, in a kind of a legal way. What was interesting, however, is that after that story became public, I think Sophacy APT, they burned about 50 days in a row, and all those 50 days, they kind of had his mark in theirs. And I was wondering if actually, after the story became public, if actually he was somehow coerced into giving them up, and the rate at which these 0 days were being burned was absolutely insane, one after another. And it seemed like when one was burned, there was another one ready to be burned, but with like almost in the same place. Vulnerability was like a few lines above or below the previous one, so it all felt like someone was pushing him. Yeah, there's like a lot of different things which can happen here. Of course, Casey, I think, has a lot of experience as well with such things.
Well, yeah, and I think this is sort of goes back to what we're talking about with how things have evolved since the 90s as well, because the laws and the overarching kind of approach that's taken legally that's in play more often with ODE is actually the DMCA, not so much the CFAA. Like the DMCA, it's the Copyright Act essentially, but it's been used quite a lot to do things around security research that involve bypassing anti-circumvention controls within software, which tends to be stuff that you can pick up and hold. Like it's your software, whereas CFAA is generally more relevant to someone else's software. So the fact that I think like SaaS and our reliance on platforms, I mean, even right now, that's been a shift, I think, in how we consume technology overall, which reflects on the available target space for security research across the board, but also I think what bad actors and even what offensive buyers that you could think of as good actors are most interested in from a targeting standpoint. So there's been a whole bunch of different shifts from that perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned something interesting, is that not all exploit use is necessarily bad. There are, I guess we'd say, legitimate uses. So going slightly on that in terms of the law, I'm gonna grill you, Casey, because I've got a bone to pick with you, sir.
Join the queue, buddy.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
Yeah. So, as curious in what role do you believe that NDAs play in securing the internet? Are they necessary? Do they do more harm than good? And how exactly does a non-disclosure agreement relate to disclosure?
Okay, I'll answer the second one first. A non-disclosure agreement does not relate to disclosure, I think. And that's in the ideal world, once everyone's on the same page about how this works and what's okay, what's not okay. Kind of going back to where we started with why is this still even a conversation in the first place, is that the internet hasn't really agreed how to do it well. So you end up in a position where, okay, you're doing security research. I, as the vendor, have the right, or at least feel like I have the right, to go after you legally to control what you do with that information that you've found. And you end up in this really awful position where submitting a vulnerability in good faith to try to make things more safe actually almost creates a condition where you've incriminated yourself at that point. So I think the confusion around NDAs being a part of disclosure is actually that's not a good thing at all. So back to the first question, this is kind of what I was getting at a bit earlier on around the difference between disclosure and crowdsourcing. Like if you're going out to a group of people and saying, okay, we want to invite you in, it's basically the situation where the program owner is the one who initiates the conversation, as opposed to the security researcher or the hacker being the one who initiates the conversation. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the latter, in my mind, is disclosure, and like, you found the bug, as long as you're taking on your own risk and your own kind of legal things that might be around what you're doing, you're effectively, there's nothing effectively stopping you from doing anything other than the potential for recourse, right? If it's an invitation that to participate in something, that's different. That's kind of like getting invited in to do contract work, or getting invited in to be employed, being invited in to do something under Chatham House, whatever else. That's where I still think that whole idea of non-disclosure, I think, is quite reasonable, just as a function of doing business. But where these two things, or the two concepts, get confused, I think that's super dangerous. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see. Yeah, if it's initiated by the company, requiring an NDA to participate is very different from someone approaching and saying, "Here's the thing I found," and I mean, as we've seen loads of times, companies go, "Great, here's an NDA," and never talk about this again. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, I think transparency and everything getting fixed, that's the ideal state. Like my utopian view of software security is almost where we're applying Kirchhoff's principle to how we build things. I would love that to be how it works. Like the reality is that we're a long way from that, but I think that's the aspirational kind of goal, and logically where the internet's going to wind up at some point in the future. So ergo, transparency is a fundamental part of how we secure ourselves. But at the same time, discretion and the flow of information, the control of that is a part of business and business practice. So how do you kind of reconcile those two things? I will say that the way that this debate, or this kind of it's like this huge conspiracy or whatever else is being reduced, is actually not very productive either. Because what it's doing is it's giving all of the work that's being done to make disclosure without this sort of thing in place more normalized a bad rap, and it's actually making it harder for the right things to become more common.
I'm going to reference a question from the third member of our panel who chickened out and decided not to actually join us, Dave Itel. But Carsten, in terms of transparency and non-disclosure, are there implants that you would not disclose?
So, well, first of all, I wonder if Dave chickened out because we were using Zoom, so he's afraid of us using those $500,000 all days on his Zoom account. Well, more seriously, I mean, on this question, which is a very good question, and the eternal debate about what's ethical, and well, I've said it many times, I'm all for transparency. We can't make exceptions. Like, this is the basic rule of detecting malware, is that you cannot make exceptions for anyone. And well, imagine if you just start making exceptions for someone, then that immediately will be, let's say, picked up in all sorts of ways. It can be picked up by the media. And even worse, imagine that you're simply choose not to detect some malware or exploit, right? And then somebody else finds that, they just take the malware and they use it against the country, let's say, of the first attacker. So with the security products, it just doesn't work like that. You have to detect everything. I guess there's a fine point there between detection and disclosing. And I think this is a more subtle kind of a question, if the disclosure actually helps or not. And there's, for instance, a number of O days which have been recently patched in Windows. There's been a lot of, let's say, shady things around these 0 days, such as it's unclear who reported them. They've, let's say, Microsoft kind of warned about them, but again, there hasn't been a patch for some time, so it took them quite a while to make a patch, and there have been a bunch of rumors about the fact that these O days were used, let's say, by certain actors. But nevertheless, Project Zero, Google Project Zero did research, did report them. In the end, I think it was Google Project Zero who discovered those 0 days. And it's quite possible that they were used for very legitimate reasons. But again, exceptions once you start going into that direction, there's no turning back. So you can't make exceptions.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very fair point, and I think in a way, if if you are a legitimate threat actor and you cannot bypass a commercial AV, then up your game. It's not their job to make exceptions for you. It's your job to do better than them. So I think that's it's all in the game. It's entirely fair. So let's see. One thing that happened very recently today was the IBM confusing a vulnerability disclosure for a bug bounty report and saying, no, it's out of scope, and then having O-days dropped on them. So I think that maybe goes back to the confusion that you were talking about, Casey, that the, people getting...
Definitely. I mean, not to speak to that particular situation because I'm not inside it, but looking at it from the outside in and having seen things like that before, there are aspects of doing a bug bounty program that's don't necessarily involve or include this idea of hey guys, we should be able to see hear things that come in from the internet. Like I think, the vulnerability disclosure and bug bounty programs are run best by the companies that recognize that like vulnerabilities are functionally a product of the fact that humans make mistakes sometimes, and instead of treating that like a thing that gets almost suppressed in how they talk about it. It's like, yeah, that's a part of what we're going to have to work with as a software developer. So let's figure out how to identify when that's happened, how to learn from it, and how to try not to repeat it again in the future. This is another area where, not everyone's there. That's kind of the utopian state. And there's some companies that do that really well, but it's not the default, I don't think. And you end up in this position where the engagement with security researchers can get confused internally with this overall idea of a vulnerability disclosure process or program. And that's when stuff like this happens. The other example is when people, or when organizations go out and do a whole bunch of signaling around their bug bounty program, but they haven't necessarily built out vulnerability coordination on the back end. So they've got, and something that, one of the areas where Katie and I are in pretty violent agreement when it comes to incentivizing from the open internet, like being able to do something with what you hear is pretty important too. So have you done that piece? There's all sorts of different ways that can get conflated, but what we do see is organizations that do it well. Like you can get to that point where it is just a part of how you build software. Clearly with this particular case, that wasn't fully kind of socialized across the business and not everyone was on the same page.
Yeah, cool. You've brought up basically the DDoS by vulnerability report problem that can be exposed, where basically if you only have so many engineers watching your bug queue and you suddenly get 10 times as many bug reports, then
and I think with that, straight up, I think almost any organization that needs security feedback can potentially benefit from crowdsourcing because it lets them access people that they find it otherwise hard to access. That's on the private basis. I think every organization should have a vulnerability disclosure policy and an intake channel, because I think that's becoming just a part of corporate social responsibility on the internet, right? When you talk about a bug bounty program in the public sense, where it's, hey, everyone, have at us and we'll pay you if you find something, I think that there's a far narrower group of organizations that's actually suitable for right now and probably into the future as well, because you do have to have that ability to respond quickly and be quite mature in that respect. So yeah, there is a difference there too.
So we're getting kind of close to the end, but there was a good question in the chat that I want to bring up, which is the thoughts on bug severity and disclosure timelines. Mentioning, for example, the Intel bugs that were embargoed for about a year versus the, Project Zero hard 90-day limit. So does anyone, Costin, opinions?
Absolutely. I think the severity has a very, let's say, significant, should have a very significant impact on the disclosure timeline. I'll give you an example. Possibly, let's say that the amount of people that are affected, not just that people that could be potentially affected, but the actual number of people who are affected, let's say right now about this. And that means that whatever vulnerability is being exploited in the wild, and maybe there are thousands of people out there who are being targeted and infected through this vulnerability, that kind of justifies, in my opinion, a shorter disclosure timeline. So a deadline of something like 2 weeks or 30 days in such cases when the impact is huge, a bug that can potentially affect millions of people, and we know it's already in the wild, it's already getting exploited. And you know that the moment there's a rumor about a patch, then the attackers will try to basically get the best possible bang for the buck from this bug, and they're gonna be targeting everybody. And there, it absolutely makes sense to have shorter disclosure windows. At the same time, the bugs that are not necessarily remote code execution bugs, but maybe that require pre-existing access to that system, such as maybe reading processor memory from different states and so on. Maybe those are not that severe, and so in that case, in my opinion, it makes sense to have longer disclosure timelines.
That and the system complexity as well. Like, the 10 cent stuff that came out in Tesla were able to, ingest that, fix it, regression test it, and roll it out to their fleet, I think in 12 days end to end, which is not normal for a fleet of vehicles that's on the road. So there's all sorts of different things in terms of how long it's actually going to take to mitigate or remediate in the wild that come into play there too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. We have no time, but I'm still going to sneak in a last question because I think it's quite relevant. This is for Casey, and I'm curious. We have all these different disclosure debates, but do we have any data about anything? So, like, do we have a way of measuring effectiveness? Like, this full disclosure got a bug fixed in 3 days versus this private disclosure, it was vulnerable for 6 months. Do we have any way of doing that? And how would we know if things are working? So.
Yeah. So in like the comparison across different types of program, no. And I don't think we're working at a point where the law of large numbers is fully in effect yet. Like, full disclosure is a pretty effective way to get people to pay attention, but it's also incredibly disruptive and causes all sorts of other things. So like there's like anecdotal stuff you can pull together and just kind of look at it like that. With the broader data set and the way that I want to look at that kind of data, I would say the answer to that is, you can see the trends, but the overall data set doesn't really exist in a consolidated way yet. What I look for, what I think is starting to be kind of circled around in the market, two things for a vuln disclosure program. It's really the responsiveness. Like, how long does it take an organization to actually fix an issue? Are they getting back to the reporter quickly? Are they maintaining that contact? Are they like not leaving people in the dark? And do they get the issue remediated, especially if it's critical, in a space of time that's ideally getting shorter as a trend, as they get better at that? Because this is all about feedback loops. It's not about like whacking a bug, it's about improvement. And then on the bounty side, I think it's, do you have, like, I sort of think of it like like a fireproof safe. When you go out and buy a fireproof safe, it says this thing will last for 6 hours at 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. when you think about what defenders are doing, it's like their job is to increase the cost of attack. So, okay, is the bug price going up over time with like the same or a lower cadence of valid vulnerabilities being discovered in that software? I think that's a rough proxy, but yeah, that's forming.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would say that in terms of using price as a proxy, the source of the pricing matters because, for example, in a bug bounty program, there's only one buyer for the bug. So the demand for, I guess, Facebook bugs is only really Facebook. No one else is going to get much value out of that overall, sort of generally speaking. But when you're talking about the offensive market, there's, also the demand side, which has an impact on pricing, and that could be more important. So, even for, Microsoft, if demand goes up, but the number of bugs that are available or that are available as fully formed exploits is fixed, the price is going to go up without that being an indication.
Yeah, I think that, you're absolutely right. The price is ultimately set by the market. I do think it's like, vulnerabilities as like overall right across the board are like this really weird type of gold that like sometimes like self-detonates and sometimes it pops up somewhere different, and like there's all these weird kind of attributes to it. But the idea of it being scarce and progressively more difficult to find as more people go looking for it, because part of what you're also doing as a finder is trying to beat the other guy. A lot of those attributes of the marketplace, I think, are actually quite similar. So I think, as this goes along, like that pricing stuff starts to normalize and the trends start to pop out. We can see some of that, definitely. I don't think, as I said before, the law of large numbers is necessarily in play, where you can say this is what a bug is worth defensively and offensively just yet. But we're definitely working on that because it's a question that everyone wants the answer to.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should basically put an end to the, if you find a bug, it's worth $10 billion on the black market. It's just not the case.
My missing cookie header is worth, it's a bug bounty millionaire. Yeah.
All right. We are out of time, unfortunately. So big thank you to Casey and Costin and Dave Vitale. And, back over to you, Matt.
Thank you, guys.
Social distancing, you say? The future is watching. Welcome to Opcode Virtual Summit.
Hey, and welcome back.
Good job.
So, I hope you guys are still having a good time. So, if you have any more questions, you can still ask them in the chat. There's a bunch of things we didn't really have time to cover, but trying to keep a hard deadline for panels of 45 minutes. But yeah, like there's also like markets also we didn't really have time to talk about, like the Chinese not being allowed to participate in the bug bounties and in the US, etc. But I guess that will be a discussion for another time. And our last presentation is gonna be from Josh Ricard from Swimlane. Are you with us, Josh?
Yep. Yeah, I
Awesome.
am. I can't start my video, so I don't know if that's.
Yeah, you should have
started. Yeah, it says the host has stopped it from sharing, so I'm not sure why. I mean, my video, my webcam, not the screen stuff. Screen, I think I can share. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, all good. And let me try to do
good.
this.
Just making sure.
1, 2, 3, and yeah, all good. Yeah, you can start.
I still can't share my webcam.
Yeah, I mean, if you can't, it's no big
Guess I
deal.
don't.
Don't worry too much about it.
Okay, cool.
As to
Alright.
start video, yeah.
There we go. There we go. Cool. I mean, it's like the perfect background. All right. So are we good?
Yeah, you can start. All good.
Okay. All right. So today we're going to be talking about a topic called search and delete using eDiscovery, using EWS, Exchange Web Services, and Graph APIs. So a little bit about myself. My experience ranges from sysadmin to blue team, DFIR. I just like to automate things, a lot of code with Python and PowerShell. And as you can see, I like long walks with binary trees. So that's enough about me. Let's talk about Exchange. So Exchange is a complex beast. So if you have an on-premise Exchange, all your different clients will actually communicate over different services that are offered up by an Exchange server. So whether that's EIS, EWS, NS, PI, MAPI, so on and so forth. But all of that is really just kind of stored in a mailbox database, a data store. And so each individual component, though, also can communicate with Active Directory or other services internal to your organization. If we scroll down a little bit, the Exchange Web Services that we're going to focus on is EWS or Exchange Web Services. It is an HTTP SOAP XML service, so not your traditional REST APIs or anything like that. It basically has central access to all services and features of Microsoft Exchange. And the overall architecture, as you can see, is that you have an EWS application, whether that's your client, and we'll talk a little bit about ActiveSync and auto-discover. But part of it is that you'll just send an HTTP request to a load balancer, then a client access server or client access server array communicates between auto-discover, which then connects to either Active Directory or any number of directory services. Or you could go by using EWS, you can actually access Active Directory as well as all the mailbox data stores of the databases that contain every message. There's some basic off there, but really we don't need to be too concerned about that right now. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is this Python package that I wrote called PyEWS. It is a cross-platform way to interact with Exchange Web Services, whether you're on Exchange 2010 or 2019. I could support 2007, but even at 2010, shame, it's just shame. But we have an Exchange Online, also the Office 365, the current version. This basically will wrap all the eDiscovery endpoints that are available through a Python interface or a library that you can import and use it. Documentation and the repository, it is up on pip. We'll talk about that. OS X or Linux install, pip install PyEWS. Same on Windows, pretty easy. It works with 2.7 and 3.x, mostly 3.6 and above. But so the main pieces of PyEWS, and we'll break down each kind of component, is this user configuration object. And this is just a class that you import. You just say from PyEWS, import user configuration. And it has a bunch of different components that you can configure it depending on what you need. The biggest thing with authentication to any eDiscovery or having the rights to search other people's mailboxes is the ability to have one of these kind of permission groups associated with your account, whether that's eDiscovery rights, compliance, or even your organizational management type role. That is, please don't do that. Even at eDiscovery, you have to be pretty strict on it. But for the basis of it, to start off, if you already have an account that has that right, then you automatically have the ability to basically search every single person's mailbox and do other actions within Exchange. These are God modes. So you have this user configuration. You just pass in your username and password, and you're good to go. So one thing I want to mention here is that currently PyEWS, Exchange in general actually supports OAuth 2 authentication. And PyAWS, I have a branch that needs to be merged in and all that, but it currently only supports the traditional username and password, which is pretty common for most organizations. If you have an on-premise Exchange, you're probably not using the WOPC. Impersonation rights. So we can authenticate as those, elevated permissions or those elevated groups, or we can actually impersonate another mailbox. To do that, you have to actually apply what they call an application impersonation, or this MS-exchange impersonation. Must be given to all the mailboxes and accounts that you want to have the ability to impersonate. What that means is that, hey, I'm Joe, but I want to act like Bob or Susan or whoever, and act as if I want to access my own personal email. So by giving that, with this impersonation object, you can actually pass in a principal name, an email address, and a couple other options we'll talk about in the next kind of section. But for the most part, if you want to impersonate, you'll have to be very selective of what members have that right. If not, just use the e-discovery if you have the access. It's going to be much easier. But PyAWS does support impersonation. So by doing that, you still pass in that username and password, but you also pass in this my impersonation object here. And what this does is really, this is the class for impersonation. And we'll break down these components. I'm just trying to ease everyone into EWS and XML, but basically what we're doing is we're passing in this variable of principal name, a SID, or an SMTP address, or a primary SMTP address. So it's really just email address and SID, but they're just different names depending on how it's set up in your environment. But what we're doing is really just creating this header object of SOAP. And so you're passing in and we're modifying the raw SOAP request by adding this additional impersonation connecting ID, whether that's your email address or SID or whatnot. We're just generating this XML. Okay, so if you'd like to use that impersonation, you first need to, again, create that impersonation object and you pass it in. Auto-discover. Is everyone, well, I don't know if you're too familiar with auto-discover, but it's when you connect a Windows domained machine to Outlook, and it automatically discovers your Exchange settings or your Outlook settings. That's auto-discover. It's really just a service endpoint that's provided by EWS, but it's kind of funny to me. Maybe I'm just super nerd, but the Microsoft recommends taking the following approach when actually discovering the auto-discover endpoints. So in Active Directory, there are objects that are hidden sometimes, depending what they're called SCPs or service connection point, and it actually points to the array or certain Exchange servers that you have in your environment. If you have a huge farm of them, or only 2 or 1 or whatever it is, these will actually have the entries in Active Directory that point to that specific Active Directory or that EWS server. So the other that they recommend is do that first, but then generate potential locations based on the user's email address. That's literally their recommendation. That's how their code and their logic and their .NET code and all that works is the same methodology. So it doesn't actually, PyAWS doesn't use SCP. I'm going to add it as an additional component that you can add on, but it would actually bloat the package by interacting with LDAP and Active Directory quite a bit. But what we do is actually generate this list based off of your email address that you provided into that user configuration. And we'll generate basically these URL types or these URL extensions. And these are the locations of all the auto-discover services or any combination thereof. And so we'll just try each one of these. If you just wanted to use our the built-in auto-discover component. If not, you can actually, and we'll talk about that a little, you can pass in a different path. But if you just wanted to use auto-discover, we automatically do that for you. All right, and so once you've actually, pulled that information back, we actually pull down additional attributes about this server and about this user. So the credentials, well, we pass those, but we have the EWS URL, and of course you did that. Demo gods. All right, so we pass in the Exchange service and also the entire raw SOAP request, which you can actually get across all the functionality within PyAWS. So AutoDiscover. AutoDiscover is a very specific endpoint that you have to provide to the EWS service. And to kind of not go into too much of a debate between EWS or SOAP APIs and REST, where with SOAP, no matter what, if you're trying to get data, you're always going to do a post method, HTTP method to that service. You're never going to do a get or a delete or something like that. SOAP is all, I mean, I hate to say that the RFC is kind of wishy-washy, but it's pretty much all is always going to be a post. And so what you have to do is you have to form this XML body to this service, and it's all wrapped around an envelope. And this envelope has these different namespaces that you have to identify or define. And this XML-NS, that means it's a namespace. And the A is, they're different attributes. Like A is for action, or actually WSA is for action. But XSI, SOAP, standard, so on and so forth. So you're creating this envelope, and then we're creating an individual header. And inside of this header, we can have different options just depending on what we're trying to actually implement. With the AutoDiscover service itself, well, with all requests, you're going to pretty much have to put in the requested version, and it's a very specific dot notation version, like 15.0.37.42. But we've already kind of figured that out with PyAWS, so you don't have to worry about any of that. But as part of this action, I want to actually call the AutoDiscover endpoints, or this exchange. Ignore the number, it's just kind of, that's when it was first released, basically. And AutoDiscover, and then you have get user settings as the actual action that I want to perform. Again, if we wanted to do any sort of exchange impersonation, we would add that value there. And the 2 means this is what the user I want to get info about. As part of the body, though, of all these messages, or each individual message has very defined attributes and nested patterns. And so if you hated JSON, man, SOAP and XML is your worst enemy. But get user settings request message, this is basically saying, hey, I want to get all of these settings from this user by sending this request message. And I'm passing in the mailbox that I want to actually get the settings for. And these are the settings that I actually want to return back to me if they're available. Internal EWS URL, external DN, mailbox, Active Directory server, so on and so forth. And task version, this is your client access server version. So we send this request, we're sending a post request, and we'll automatically return these attributes that are used in other functionality within PyAWS. All right, so some additional options with this AutoDiscover or with this user configuration is that if you already know the Exchange version, then you can pass that in. And that makes it a lot simpler for PyAWS to figure it out. If not, then we will basically try every single one of these, greatest to least, as well as all those URLs that I was showing you before. So I think it's a total of potentially 35 different requests, just because it doesn't, it'll basically fail if we try that request, and we'll just try another one and keep going until there's no more, and then we'll finally fail. So with the Exchange version, if you do pass that in, it makes it a lot easier. If not, no worries. You won't notice a huge difference. So if you do not wish to actually use AutoDiscover, then you can actually set it to false and very specifically provide that EWS URL. Typically, if we're like Office 365, it will be outlook.office365 /EWS/exchange.asmx, which actually redirects to an SVC and what they call a WSDL. It's a defined language file that understands and can parse your request. All right, so with PyAWS, I'm just going to giving you a brief overview here before we get into the nitty gritty, but the currently available service endpoints are like delete item, get inbox item, get searchable mailboxes. We can resolve names as well as search mailboxes. And it's really easy if you import the base class of service endpoint. You can actually extend PyAWS to wrap for really by having one method that defines your XML, and you're good to go. So typical workflow, we're going to retrieve all the mailboxes. We don't know what mailboxes we have access to, and I don't require you to know their unique IDs. So part of this is we have this get searchable mailboxes. It will automatically, based on the user configuration settings that you've chosen, whether impersonation or not, will automatically try to find any groups or all accounts within your Active Directory or Azure Active Directory tenant, and will expand any other additional groups and return basically a unique list of all automated, well, of all groups or mailboxes within your Active Directory tenant. Once you do that, then we can actually search all mailboxes, and then we want to delete those messages. So we'll talk about this stuff in a minute, but here's an example of actually running get searchable mailboxes. And so we'll print out, you know, the display name, external email address, any GUI IDs, and basically the primary SMTP address. And what we really want is this reference ID. And you see it, this is a nested OU group, and this is all based on Azure Active Directory path locations. So we need those to actually invoke and search, but we do all this for you. So once you've actually you know, identified all those groups, whether if you have e-discovery rights, then you're going to get all users. If you have impersonation, you have very select users, we're only going to be able to return those specific users that you have rights to search. So giving a single list or a single or a list of mailbox reference IDs, then we can actually apply the search. And part of this is part of the search mailboxes endpoint. And we pass in this string, and we'll talk about the different options here. But we have the user configuration object that we've created, as well as that reference mailbox list. And then we could print out, okay, the entire message or very specific attributes about that message. Here is when we're searching mailboxes, here's actually printing all the properties. And I'm, you know, I have a weight, and so I'm printing them out to make it easier to show. But here's the body of the message: conversation index, created time, date times, display to, and when it gets there, so you can see there's a lot of different properties here. We have the message ID, but then we have the raw MIME content, that, well, the base 64 encoded raw MIME content, as well as, you know, read time, sender, sort, subject, values, all that. But then we also have the raw decoded HTML content of that message. So you can use that to do whatever you want at this point. And you can see there's an accept language, all the X headers, so on and so forth in the entire body. So that search syntax that I was just showing was, you know, just subject : account. This means that we just want to find any message within all those users that we just identified as a account in the keyword or in the subject of the message. But we have a lot of different options that I think will prove beneficial for a lot of different use cases. But here's kind of this AQL, they call it, or AQS, or Advanced Query Syntax. And so imagine if you wanted to actually search for any email that had the word account subject, but you also wanted anything in the body that had the word click, and it was actually received today. All right, so pretty useful, you know, if you have just a standard spammy fish email, mass, you know, click here to upgrade your account, whatever. So if you have a subject though, but what if you wanted to get any attachment as well that may be on that message that has the word fax? That could be the extension, or the actual name of the file, so on and so forth. Or let's say we wanted to do, only from very specific individuals, and the subject had any of these words, whether it's raise, upgrade, warning, or expire, not concatenated, just any of them. Pretty useful. Then you also have subject Office 365, but not from our IT department or whatever that email address is. Though you can identify, people trying to spoof you, basically, or sending them off to users. But let's take it a step further when we say, okay, give me anything in the body that starts with HTTP and it was received today. You can search all your mailboxes every day and get every single URL, and it can be different patterns. This is just an example of URLs that have been actually sent to your users today. Additionally, you could add or just do this separately of any attachment sent in your organization. And you could actually pull those down, hash them, and then run them through your thread intel, do whatever you want. So there's a lot of power that you can use with the AQS. You just have to be a little fancy with it and read some docs. So I actually have a class wrapper that I'm working on because of all these, but it should verify your AQS syntax for you. But it's not complete at this time, but it will be soon. All right, so now we can actually delete that item. And so when we actually want to delete it, we need to specify either all the messages that we just found, or we need to actually specify a very specific message, whether that's, the second one on the list or third one on the list. And basically, it's going to be this kind of long message ID that we need. And you have to make sure that you're doing it. If that message is moved or modified in any way, this ID will change, so it'll no longer be there. So it's not a static message or message ID. So we have a couple different options. Default is going to be moved to deleted items when you actually call this delete item method. But you can soft delete, which actually puts it in the dumpster or the recovered deleted items, or just a straight hard delete where it is removed. You cannot recover it from the mail store. So you have a couple different options as far as that. I recommend move to deleted items while you're playing around with it. But if you need it if you need a hard delete, then use with caution. All right, so that's AWS. We're basically requesting these SOAP XML structures, and we're generating it, and it's kind of a wrapper to generate that. Hopefully, I'll be getting to the point where I'm wrapping the entire AWS service infrastructure, but it's proven to be a little funky. So with Graphfish, this is another port of it. It's called Graphfish. It's a Python package. It actually uses Microsoft Graph API. We do have similar functionality as far as creating a search, deleting. We can get some mailbox rules, so on and so forth. It's all on pip, and you can install it. But one of the biggest things that I want to point out is that Graph uses OAuth 2 authentication, which you need to understand the different application scenarios and the grant flows that they actually have. There's basically two different ones that I like to use. This application scenario. These are always going to be user interaction authentication required. Basically, you're going to need this pop-up. You're going to get this. You're going to sign in to Office 365 or whatnot, and you're going to authorize this application to use it. Which is great, but if you're trying to automate things, what you want to use is an application authentication or a domain or daemon service. This means that no user interaction is required, and you just pass it in a client ID, client tenant, and client secret, and you're off to the races. Just use a secure account or service account or a service principal. If you want to know more about OAuth, I do have some blogs out here. You can reach out, so on and so forth, or I'll post them in the chat later. So delegated authentication, again, these are the two different examples. Really, it's just a username and password are needed when you're actually using a delegated authentication or interacting authentication with OAuth 2. If you're using a backend or client credentials auth flow, you just need to provide those keys and you're off to the races. So why is Graph different? Graph's different because basically with AWS, you're searching all mailboxes and you're returning those results. With Graph, you're actually creating a search folder in each individual user that you're searching's mailbox that is hidden to them and can only be accessed by users with those appropriate permissions. So you're basically creating a folder in their mailbox that they just can't see. So once you actually configure this search folder, then you pass in parameters as far as when you're creating that folder to populate based on those search criteria. And this is similar to the AQL, slightly different, but it's pretty similar. Any email actually matching that criteria is then copied and to this folder, and then you can actually retrieve those messages. This means that instead of searching everything at once and only returning everything at the end, you actually can offload, and each mailbox is actually processing kind of in async or synchronous fashion. So this also means we can actually update, modify, or delete our search rules for a specific search folder. So we can create a new search. We actually pass in the name of the folder we want, wherever we want the search folder to be nested underneath or hidden underneath. In this example, it's inbox. And then we just provide, okay, the subject contains the word expires. We can get all those messages, again, print them out by just calling this messages method once we've actually created our search. And then we just pull in those messages, and we can actually delete those individual messages by just passing in the connector and user principal name that you want to delete from, and then you just pass in the message ID. If you want to actually delete that entire message search folder, you could actually do that as well by just giving it the folder name and the message ID that you want to delete from that search folder. Sorry. All right, so delete, pretty simple. Again, defaults to me, to my current mailbox as a user principal, because it's assuming this may be only used by you're just using it for yourself. But if not, you just need to pass in a list or a single user principal, and we'll delete it. So what I was meaning with the updated search is you can actually make changes to that search folder's parameters. So if I wanted to actually change it to contain subject expires with an exclamation point, what that will do is actually modify the search criteria for that folder, and any messages that did match the previous query but don't match the new one will be removed from that folder. So be careful. I just recommend creating another search folder, maybe with like a 1, or just kind of increment the numbers. However, it doesn't seem to be impactful when you create like 100 of them, because I've done that. I don't know if on scale, but in a limited capacity, it didn't really matter much. And then actually, if you just want to delete that search folder, again, you can do the search.delete, and it'll delete that current search folder for you. All right, so I think I'm close on time, but so PyEWS is on pip, PyPy, GitHub. The read the docs is out there. I actually just pushed a new change right before this talk, and then Graphfish is out there. It's on GitHub. It's also on PyPy as well. If you want to reach out, I'm MS Administrator on Twitter, GitHub. I have a lot of open source projects out there, so check them out. And then my blogs, letsautomate.it. Yeah, thank you very much.
Well, thanks to you. It was a pretty good presentation. And yeah, like I was telling you the other day, like with all those BEC thing happening now,
Yeah.
I still think like Office is a pretty big target. Like for people who are watching this presentation, one of the reason is scripts are pretty cool. It's mainly also partly, like I would say mostly, that Office 365 user interface is really bad. It's just like, it's terrible.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, their e-discovery is basically non-existent, and it's this new search folder thing. It's weird, but it makes sense.
yeah, there's so many features and options. It's like, I'm like, how can a mail client and like thing can be like so complicated, you know? It's like,
Yeah,
that's pretty cool. I don't know if anyone in the chat has some question, but in the meantime, everything is on GitHub, right?
Yes, yeah, everything's on GitHub, and you should be able to reach all the docs and everything out there. Again, we have read the docs for the Graphish is pretty well documented as well, and I'll post some additional links to like OAuth 2, and that's a little tricky to kind of set up if you're just not familiar with how OAuth 2 kind of works in its infancy or Microsoft's implementation, which is pretty standard compared to most that I've come across. But yeah, it can be a little tricky. You just have to have some additional rights or have someone that can elevate or create an application in Azure AD.
Actually, one question from the chat now is: is Microsoft going to kill search mailbox PowerShell command still? I don't
know. I actually haven't heard much about that because with PowerShell 7 and everything coming out, I know that there's still some limited functionality. More than I know that they're like EWS. What I've been told is that EWS will eventually go away. I personally don't see that happening. A lot of the .NET libraries that you come across, like as well as C#, the search mailbox commandlets and all that, are very XML and EWS focused. So I just don't see it happening. I think it'll take a long time for EWS to get away because, I mean, come on, people are still on Exchange 2010. So another 20 years maybe. It might go away. But as far as killing search mailbox, I don't think that they'll be able to. The one thing that I wanted to point out with PyEWS especially is that we're making those raw XML SOAP requests, which basically is what, again, all those search mailbox and any other commands are doing good, which is much faster. I think PyEWS is quite a bit faster than all of them. I haven't actually, I guess, done some testing in that regard. Maybe I should, but you don't have that layer of extraction. You don't have to load all those libraries and everything. You just use requests and form the XML, and you're good to go.
Yeah, like you mentioned, XML is pretty it's pretty hard to read. Like there's no alternative. Everything has to be done through XML, or
yeah, right. For raw EWS, yes. Graph is where they're trying to get everyone to go to, especially with the OAuth 2 and authentication. EWS supports OAuth 2 authentication, but they're trying to move everyone away from EWS into the graph kind of. I think Microsoft in general has tried to move everyone to graph for all services, but with eDiscovery, there's not really a really good alternative that I've seen their UIs and with the I think they call it search and purge or something like that, or they used to. It's not very clean, and it crashed on me a few times, so I just went from the API perspective, and it's much faster.
Yeah, what about Graph API now? Is it pretty stable, or is it still because
I
looked at it like a
part.
year ago, a lot of the API and the response you would have would be like, incomplete, it was not that so still in early stage, I guess.
They've gotten better with their docs and everything, definitely. A lot of the features maybe like in a you have to kind of read through them, honestly. There's a lot of blogs and stuff about the different components. I think the hardest thing for a lot of people is the authentication as OAuth 2. It's very non-traditional. Basically, what you're trying to do is when you send that, those current credentials, it'll authenticate to Azure AD or your Azure AD tenant, and then returns a token, which then you use for all other requests, which then that request actually goes and checks AD and says, hey, is this token still good? And, it's kind of that triangle approach. But Graph overall is pretty good. They have a lot of actually really cool features in beta, in their beta branch or their beta endpoints. which I would definitely, if you're interested in graph and all that, check those out. There's some really cool functionality, like sending SMS or just any notification to any device. That's where, well, I guess in V2 of their APIs, that's where like Defender ATP lives and stuff like that. And they have some additional endpoints as well in the beta. So I think it's pretty stable for the most part.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't run into too many bugs. Yeah.
I mean, like the main problem I have with it every time is like every time I want to try a feature, I realize I have to upgrade to like Azure Active Directory, like P1 or P2. I'm like, what the hell, you know, like you're telling me now, and like, why didn't tell me like 30 days ago when I wanted the logs, you know? It's like,
like the Azure,
it's very
like
hard to
premium
read.
one,
It's like you need to be like a sales engineer to use it.
Oh, you do. I actually, we had a sales engineer, and I had him literally like a 3-hour meeting trying to explain to me like how all the pricing and everything works. It was.
It's very confusing.
What I figured out is there's M365 and then Office 365, which then I think they just changed to M365.
I think they changed it.
There's each level, and Azure is out of that scope. So all the services that you think of, like Office Mail and all that, are all in the M365, and Azure is as well as a separate entity. It's complex. I actually have a write-up. Maybe I'll share that out too.
Okay, yeah, with pleasure. Well, there's no more question in the chat. Thanks again for joining us today. It was pretty awesome to have you, and really enjoyed the presentation. And,
Thank you.
I like the no slides mod. You know, like you did it pretty well. That's pretty good.
Yeah, and I'll put these up there as well. Like I like the using markdowns. It's a lot easier.
Yeah. I mean, markdowns are like pretty good,
share them out.
and at least it's a good motivation to document stuff pretty well. You know.
Yeah, and I don't have to do it twice.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Social distancing, you say? The future is watching. Welcome to OpCode Virtual Summit.
Well, welcome back, everyone. So I guess that's it for today, and I hope you had a great time. I see some people also connected from Kenya again. That's pretty cool. Like I was saying the first time at the first edition, one of the nice thing now is that at least we know like people from everywhere can watch. So the cool thing is like when you're speaking also here is like you know that basically people who are watching you are not only like the security professionals that would usually attend the security conferences, but also like I try to push a lot to get more like students and also like people who cannot really like go to the US or Europe for conferences to attend, because then they can have access to good content. And
but I appreciate what you all are doing. This is awesome. And I think that I'd love to hear trying to squeeze it into half an hour is a lot of info, but hopefully it was good enough.
Yeah, I was like, actually, I was thinking about it, like 30 minutes. The thing is, it's a pretty good like format overall, because, you don't want people to like extend too much. And also like people like usually their attention rate, would drop at some point, So it's kind of like a tricky, like, like a point, to find, like you want to make it like long enough, but not too long. You still want people to be like interested by it.
Hopefully the XML thing. Oh my god.
No, that's
fun.
No, definitely. And so just gonna like I guess I will close the stream now. Thanks again for all our speakers for joining us today. So let me see if I can just show it on my screen again. Yeah. So thanks to Alex, Juan, Casey, Costin, Gurk, and Josh for joining us today. It was really cool to have all of you tonight. Thanks again also for like the chat, for participating. It's really a cool thing, to have a bunch of questions also from the chat. If you know people who would be interested to speak, so like I said, the fourth edition, I guess, of that stream is going to be in 2 weeks, so it's going to be on the 6th of May. And yeah, so Thomas Reed is going to be giving the keynote. If you know anyone else who would be interesting to have as a speaker, who would be interested in speaking, don't hesitate to shoot me a message, an email, or like on Twitter. Yeah, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, so like you can just get notification when we go live. At the moment, the format is still gonna be the every 2 weeks thing. Still like half a day, and I think presentation 30 minutes, for discussion panel 45 minutes. This time I try to be a bit more on schedule than the previous times. And yeah, slides will be available, I guess, tomorrow on GitHub. I'm probably gonna like shut down the Matt bedroom studio now and grab some food. So and yeah, and like I said, like the IRC stuff is dead, but because we also miss IRC, so the Discord channel is still up and alive. Actually, in a week, it's growing quite fast. I think there is like almost 150 people now, which is pretty cool. And like I was telling Ryan before, I'll try to push also a bit more to get a bit more like students and young professionals to join, because I think we can have a pretty cool ecosystem, like just like 15 years ago, and we were all using IRC, kind of like looking for some mentors online. And since everyone is locked down now, I guess it could be a good opportunity. So if like universities or like group of students, who are interested in cyber, who want to join like a cool community, like don't hesitate to share. I think that would be quite cool if we can do a bit of knowledge transfer, and where people can ask questions, because like I was saying to another friend, well, a lot of things get diluted on Twitter, so it's not really, I mean, it's still a cool medium, it's not as efficient as it could be. And yeah, blog posts are also good, but since we can do things in video now, so I guess why not, And yeah, I guess that's pretty much it for today. And I guess wherever you are, like I didn't realize that KZ was in Australia. Actually, it's like 4+ a.m. Over there, so it's pretty funny. I was texting him before. I was like, "Are you still coming? Are you still coming?" And then he was like, "Oh, I'm just drinking my coffee now. It's 3 a.m." But yeah, that's pretty funny. But yeah, thanks again for joining us today. And yeah, I guess see you in 2 weeks. So just mark your calendar for like the 6th of May. And it's going to be every 2 weeks on Wednesdays. Cool. Well, thanks to you.
Social distancing, you say? The future is watching. Welcome to OpCode Virtual Summit.